The wind did not merely blow across the high plains of the Wyoming Territory in late 1888. It scraped. It was a physical thing, a living hostility that filed down the edges of the yellowed grass and scoured the black volcanic rock until the land looked as raw as a fresh wound. Overhead, the sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the promise of snow that already capped the distant sawtooth peaks. The road to redemption was hardly a road at all. It was a pair of deep, frozen ruts carved into the hardpan, winding through the emptiness like a scar. Inside the swaying, jolting belly of the overland stagecoach, the woman calling herself Lena Marsh sat alone. She was 24 years old, though the shadows beneath her eyes and the set of her mouth made her look older. Her fingers, pale and lacking the callousness of a farm wife, were locked around the handle of a carpet bag that rested on her lap. It was a cheap bag, the floral pattern worn away at the corners to reveal the gray canvas beneath. It held 2 plain calico dresses, a Bible she no longer opened, a small sewing kit, and $42 wrapped in a handkerchief. That $42 was the price of her escape. It was the sum total of 3 years of degradation in a mining town called Silver Creek. Lydia Kane, for that was the name she had buried under layers of silence, stared out the window at the passing sagebrush. The vastness of the territory usually frightened newcomers, the sheer, crushing scale of the horizon, where the earth seemed to roll on forever until it fell off the edge of the world, could make a person feel insignificant. But to Lydia, the emptiness was a balm. In the emptiness, there were no eyes, there were no whispers, there was only the wind and the distance. She shifted on the hard leather bench, wincing as the coach hit a pothole. The suspension was shot, and every rock in the road telegraphed a jolt up her spine. She took a breath, tasting the dust that swirled inside the cabin. She had to be Lena Marsh now. Lena Marsh was a widow. She had decided. A seamstress from the east who had lost her husband to fever and was traveling west to find a quiet place to work. Lena Marsh had no history. She had never worn a dress cut too low, had never smelled the stale tobacco and cheap whiskey of a brothel parlor, had never been forced to smile when a rough hand grabbed her waist. Lydia closed her eyes for a moment, forcing the memories back into the dark box in her mind. She was starting over. Redemption. The name of the town felt like a dare. The driver, a whiskered man named Jeb, with a voice like gravel in a tin bucket, shouted something to the team of 6 horses. The coach slowed slightly as they began to ascend a rise. Jeb twisted in his seat, shouting down through the open window behind him. "Getting cold back there, miss?" Jeb hollered over the wind. "I am fine," Lydia said, her voice steady. She pulled her thin wool coat tighter around her throat. It was not nearly warm enough for a high-country winter, but it was the only coat she had. "Sky is turning mean," Jeb continued, eager for conversation to break the monotony of the drive. "We will make town before dark if the axle holds. This territory is unforgiving this time of year. Reminds me of the winter of '74. Lydia did not answer. She did not want to encourage him. She wanted to remain invisible. But Jeb was not deterred. "You picked an interesting time to come to redemption, Mrs. Marsh. Town is booming, they say, mostly because of the big outfits moving in. You heard of Silas Carver?" Lydia's spine went rigid. The air in the coach suddenly felt too thin to breathe. "Carver?" she repeated, the word tasting like ash on her tongue. "A big cattle man," Jeb said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the wind. "Running thousands of head north of here. Ruthless bastard. Pardon my French. He is swallowing up the small valleys. They say his outfit is expanding right up to the edge of town. Money flows where Carver goes. I suppose." Lydia turned her face to the window, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Silas Carver. The name was a ghost she thought she had outrun. Memories flashed, unbidden and violent. A sunlit parlor in a ranch house that used to be a happy home. Her father's voice rising in anger. And then the quiet, reptilian gaze of Silas Carver standing in their doorway, holding a hat that cost more than their entire herd. He had been the architect of her ruin. He was the reason her father lay in a grave on the other side of the territory. And he was the reason she had been cast out. destitute, to find survival in the only way a woman alone could. She gripped the carpetbag until her knuckles turned white. She could not go where Carver was. She should tell the driver to stop. She should get out and walk back the way they came, but there was nowhere to go. She had spent every cent on this ticket. "He has got a lot of men riding for him," Jeb shouted, oblivious to the terror he had ignited below. "Hard men, not the kind you want to cross." The coach crested the rise and began to descend into a narrow cut between two jagged rocky hills. The walls of the pass rose steep and dark, cutting off the afternoon light. Shadows stretched long across the road, creating pockets of obscurity where anything could hide. Lydia pressed herself back into the seat, the name Carver echoing in her mind like a curse. She was trembling. She told herself it was the cold. Suddenly, the rhythm of the hooves changed. The horses screamed, a high, terrified sound that tore through the wind. "Whoa! Hold up, you devils!" Jeb screamed. A gunshot cracked through the air, sharp and deafening. The coach swerved violently to the left. Lydia was thrown against the side of the cabin, her shoulders striking the wood hard. The carpetbag slid to the floor. Outside, the world erupted into chaos. There was the thunder of hooves, shouting, and another gunshot that splintered the wood frame of the door right beside her head. "Get down!" Jeb roared from the box, followed by the sound of him racking the lever of his shotgun. Lydia did not need to be told. Her old survival instincts, honed in a place where violence could erupt over a spilled drink or a wrong look, flared to life. She dropped to the floorboards, curling into a ball between the seats, covering her head with her arms. More shots rang out, pinging off the iron wheels. The coach was slowing down, the horses fighting the harness. Through the dust-choked window, she saw shapes, riders on horseback, their faces covered with flour sacks or bandanas. Outlaws. Road agents using the remote terrain to pinch the stage off from the world. The coach lurched to a halt, swaying dangerously. "Throw down the box, old man," a voice shouted, rough and distorted by the wind. "Throw it down, or I will put a hole in your gut big enough to drive this wagon through." "I ain't got no gold," Jeb yelled back, though his voice wavered. "Just mail and a passenger." "We will see about that." Lydia held her breath, her eyes squeezed shut. "Please," she prayed to a god she thought had stopped listening years ago. "Just take the mail. Just take the horses." Glass shattered. A gloved fist smashed through the window above her, showering her in shards. Lydia cried out, a sharp, involuntary sound. A shard of glass sliced across her cheekbone, a sting of fire that was immediately followed by the warm trickle of blood. The door was wrenched open. "Well now," the outlaw sneered. He was leaning down from his saddle, peering into the gloom of the coach. "Looks like we got something better than gold." He reached in, his hand grabbing the collar of her coat. "No!" Lydia screamed, scrambling backward, kicking out with her boots. She struck his forearm, but his grip was iron. He yanked her forward, dragging her toward the open door. The trunk, her carpetbag, tumbled out into the dirt. "Come out here, sweetheart," the man grunted, struggling to pull her through the narrow frame. "Let us get a look at you." Lydia clawed at the door frame, her fingernails splintering the wood. Panic, cold and black, swallowed her. It was happening again. The helplessness, the overpowering force of men who took what they wanted. Then, a new sound cut through the chaos. It was not the frantic shouting of the outlaws or the terrified whinnying of the team. It was the singular, flat crack of a heavy-caliber rifle fired from a distance. The outlaw, gripping her coat, suddenly let go. He jerked backward as if yanked by an invisible rope, a spray of red mist erupting from his shoulder. He fell from his saddle, landing in the dirt with a heavy thud. Lydia fell back onto the floorboards, gasping. "Rider!" someone screamed. "On the ridge!" Another shot rang out. This one struck the ground near the led horse of the outlaws, kicking up a geyser of frozen mud. The outlaws' horses, spooked by the gunfire and the smell of blood, began to wheel and buck. Lydia pulled herself up just enough to peek over the windowsill. High up on the rocky shelf overlooking the pass, a lone figure sat on a large bay horse. He was silhouetted against the graying sky. a dark shape of vengeance. He worked the lever of his rifle with a calm, fluid motion, the weapon an extension of his arm. He did not fire wildly. He fired with a terrifying, practiced precision. "Let's go! Let's go!" the leader of the outlaws shouted. The ambush had fallen apart in seconds. They were predators who wanted easy prey, not a fight with a rifleman who held the high ground. The remaining 3 riders spurred their mounts, scattering into the rocks and scrub brush like cockroaches fleeing sudden light. They left their wounded comrade groaning in the dirt, dragging himself toward the cover of a boulder. The lone rider did not chase them. Instead, he spurred his horse down the steep embankment, sliding in a cloud of dust and shale, controlling the descent with expert horsemanship. He hit the road at a gallop, the stagecoach team, terrified by the gunfire and the smell of blood, surged forward, panic taking hold. Jeb had lost the reins in the scuffle. They were flapping loose against the horse's flanks. The coach lurched, the wheels rimming the edge of a shallow ravine that dropped off 10 feet into a dry creek bed. "Whoa!" Lydia heard the rider shout. He pulled alongside the galloping team. Lydia saw him through the shattered window, a flash of dark denim, a worn leather vest, and a face obscured by the brim of a hat pulled low. He leaned out from his saddle, perilously far, and grabbed the lead horse's bridle close to the bit. He wrenched the team away from the ravine's edge, using the weight of his own horse to force them to slow. It was a maneuver of brute strength and perfect timing. The coach skidded, the wheels locking, and finally ground to a halt 20 yards down the road. Silence rushed back in, broken only by the heavy heaving of the horses and the whistle of the wind. Lydia sat frozen, her hand pressed to her bleeding cheek. Her heart was beating so hard it hurt her chest. The rider swung down from his saddle. He was tall, moving with a stiff, weary grace. He tied his horse to the back of the coach and walked to the door. "You all right in there?" His voice was low, rasping slightly, as if he hadn't used it in days. Lydia nodded, then realized he couldn't see her well in the shadows. She forced her limbs to move. She grabbed the door frame and stepped down into the cold wind. Her legs shook so badly she nearly collapsed, but she locked her knees, refusing to fall. "I am fine," she said. The words came out as a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. Louder, sharper. "I am fine." The man, Eli Mercer, stopped a few feet from her. He looked her over, his eyes narrowing. He saw the way she stood, rigid as a fence post, fighting the tremors in her hands. He saw the thinness of her coat, wholly inadequate for the weather, and he saw the blood running down the side of her face. "You are bleeding," he said. "It is just a scratch," Lydia said, lifting her chin. She looked past him to the driver's box. "Is the driver alive?" "Jeb is shaken up, but he is breathing," Eli said. He took a step closer. "That is a deep cut, ma'am. You need to tend to it before the cold sets in." Lydia looked at him then, really looked at him. He was not a young man, perhaps 32 or 33, but the lines around his eyes and mouth were etched deep by sun and worry. He had a few days' growth of dark beard. His hat was battered, sweat-stained around the band, but it was his eyes that held her. They were a dark, slate gray, and they held no cruelty. They were tired eyes. "I have nothing to bandage it with," she admitted, her voice tight. Eli didn't speak. He simply unbuttoned the cuff of his blue flannel shirt. With a sharp tug, he tore a long strip of clean fabric from the tail of the shirt where it was tucked into his trousers. He produced a canteen from his saddlebag, uncorked it, and poured a little water onto the cloth. "Hold still," he said. He stepped into her personal space. Lydia flinched, her body tensing to pull away. It was a reflex, born of 3 years of unwanted touches. Eli paused, his hand hovering inches from her face. He waited. He did not grab her. He did not force her. He simply waited for her to give permission. Lydia let out a shaky breath and nodded once. Eli gently pressed the damp cloth to her cheek. The water was cold, but his fingers were warm. They were calloused, rough as sandpaper. the hands of a man who worked with rope and wire and wood. Yet his touch was surprisingly gentle, almost reverent. He dabbed away the blood with a care she had not experienced in so long she'd forgotten what it felt like. "Glass cut," he murmured. "Missed the eye. Thank the Lord. It will scar, though. I have other scars," Lydia said before she could stop herself. Eli's eyes flicked to hers. For a second, the rest of the world, the wind, the shivering horses, the groaning driver, fell away. Lydia felt a sudden, terrifying exposure. It wasn't just that he was looking at her. It felt as if he was seeing into her. As if the name Lena Marsh was written on paper so thin he could read the truth of Lydia Kane right through it. He saw something. She saw the recognition flicker in his gaze, a furrowing of his brow, as if he were trying to recall a tune heard long ago. Lydia stepped back quickly, breaking the contact. She took the cloth from him, holding it to her face herself. "Thank you," she said. Her tone clipped. "I can manage." Eli watched her for a moment longer, his hand slowly dropping to his side. "Suit yourself." He turned and walked toward the driver. "Jeb, you got a spare wheel? That left rear looks like it took a hit." "I think so," Jeb croaked, climbing down shakily. "Eli, is that you? Eli Mercer?" "It is," Eli said. "Well, I will be damned," Jeb spat. "I have not seen you since you quit the Carver outfit. Good thing you were passing through and those boys were set on murder." Lydia froze at the mention of the name again. Quit the Carver outfit. This man had ridden for him. This man with the gentle hands had been one of Silas Carver's enforcers. The gratitude she had felt a moment ago curdled into ice in her stomach. She watched Eli as he helped Jeb check the horses. He moved with a heavy competence, calming the animals with low murmurs and firm strokes. He checked the cinches, checked the hooves. He was a part of this land, a part of the violence that ruled it. "Storm is coming in fast. Jeb," Eli said, looking at the northern sky. The clouds had turned to bruised charcoal, swallowing the peaks. "If you do not get this rig moving, you are going to get buried out here." I know," Jeb grumbled. "But the lady, she is rattled." Eli turned back to Lydia. She stood by the open door of the coach, her carpet bag retrieved from the dirt and clutched to her chest like a shield. "I am riding to redemption," Eli said to her. "I will ride escort, just in case those friends of yours decide to come back for a second try." "They are not my friends," Lydia said coldly. "Figure of speech, ma'am," Eli said, tipping the brim of his hat. They got back underway within 10 minutes. The wind had picked up, howling now, carrying the first stinging pellets of sleet. Lydia sat inside, the broken window stuffed with a blanket from Jeb's emergency supplies. But the cold still seeped in. She watched Eli through the other window. He rode slightly ahead and to the left of the lead horse, his body absorbing the rhythm of the gait effortlessly. He kept his rifle across his lap, his head swiveling, scanning the rocks and the ridge lines. She studied him. The way he sat, the saddle was loose, relaxed, yet ready to snap into violence at a second's notice. She looked at his hands, the knuckles scarred and white from the cold. He was a weapon, she realized, a tool used by men like Carver to break the world into the shape they wanted. And yet, he had stopped. He had torn his shirt for her. He had waited for her to nod before touching her. Eli rode with his chin tucked into his collar against the biting wind. His mind was not on the cold, but on the woman in the coach. Lena Marsh. That was the name Jeb had shouted up to him. But the face nagged at him like a splinter under the skin. He had seen those eyes before. Not the fear in them, that was new, but the shape of them. The dark, defiant intelligence. He cast his mind back, sifting through the years of drifting, of saloons and bunkhouses and cattle drives. A memory surfaced, hazy and distorted by time. A big house, chandeliers, Silas Carver standing at the head of a long mahogany table, laughing. And a girl, no, a young woman, standing in the doorway, wearing a pale blue dress, holding a tray. She had looked proud then, unbroken. And then another image, darker, grittier, a saloon in Silver Creek. He had been passing through 3 months ago, nursing a whiskey in the corner. He had seen a woman at the top of the stairs, painted and weary, steering a drunk miner toward a room. He hadn't looked closely then. He had made a point of not looking closely at the women in those places. It made the guilt he carried too heavy to bear. Was it her? He glanced back at the coach. She was staring at him, her face pale behind the glass. When their eyes met, she looked away instantly, staring studiously at the sagebrush. She was running. He knew the look of a runner. He had been running for 5 years himself. By the time they reached Redemption, the snow had begun to fall in earnest, thick, wet flakes that plastered the sides of the buildings and turned the main street into a slurry of freezing mud. Redemption was not much to look at. It was a hard little settlement huddled in a valley floor, surrounded by hills that trapped the wind. There was a single main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a livery stable, a general store, a blacksmith, a leaning white church with a peeling steeple, and a saloon called the Lucky Strike that spilled yellow light and piano music out into the gloom. The coach pulled up in front of the general store, which doubled as the stage stop. Jeb hauled on the brake lever. "End of the line. Mrs. Marsh!" he hollered. Lydia stepped out. The mud sucked at her boots. The air smelled of wood smoke and manure. She shivered, pulling her coat tight. She grabbed her carpet bag, refusing Jeb's offer of help. "Thank you for the ride," she said to Jeb, handing him a $1 tip she could scarcely afford. She turned to Eli. He was still mounted, looking down at her. The snow was gathering on the shoulders of his duster. "Mr. Mercer," she said. She wanted to hate him. She wanted to hate him for working for Carver, for being a part of the machinery that had crushed her family. But the bandage on her cheek whispered otherwise. "Thank you for the help." "Just doing what needed doing," Eli said. His voice was flat, guarded. I hope you find what you are looking for," she said, though she didn't know why she said it. "I am not looking for anything," Eli replied. Lydia nodded once, stiffly, and turned away. She walked into the general store, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully, a sound that seemed out of place in such a desolate evening. She needed a room. She needed a job. She needed to disappear. Eli watched her go. He watched the door close behind her, shutting out the wind. He should keep moving. He had money in his pocket, enough to get to Montana. He had no business in Redemption. Carver was expanding here, and being near Carver meant risking the past digging its way out of the grave. He looked toward the livery stable. His horse, a sturdy roan named Buster, was tired. The animal blew a breath of steam and stomped a hoof. "Yeah, I know," Eli muttered to the horse. "I am tired, too." He looked back at the general store. He thought of the blood on her cheek. He thought of the way she had flinched when he raised his hand. And he thought of Carver, pushing into this valley, bringing the same greed and violence that had ruined Eli's own peace of mind years ago. If Carver was here, trouble was coming. And that woman, Mrs. Marsh, or whoever she really was, she looked like she had just about enough trouble to drown in. Eli sighed, a sound lost in the wind. He nudged his horse forward, guiding him toward the livery stable. "Come on, Buster," he said softly. "Looks like we are staying for a spell." He rode into the warmth of the barn, sliding out of the saddle. He would take a room at the boarding house. He would pick up some work, maybe riding fence or breaking horses. He would watch, and he would wait. Outside, the snow fell harder, erasing the tracks of the stagecoach, erasing the road, turning the world into a blank white page. Winter settled on the high plains not with a whimper, but with the heavy, crushing silence of iron. By the first week of December, the yellow grass was buried under a foot of crusted white, and the wind had sharpened into a blade that sought out every gap in the clapboard houses of Redemption. For Lydia Kane, known now to the town as the widow Lena Marsh, the days measured themselves in stitches. She had secured a small, drafty corner in Mrs. Gable's dressmaker shop, a narrow space smelling of dust and lavender sachet. Her world had shrunk to the length of a needle and the span of a hem. She took in whatever work came through the door, mostly mending torn shirts for bachelor ranch hands who looked at her with shy, hungry eyes, or turning collars for the thrifty wives of local farmers. On a Tuesday afternoon, she sat by the frosted window, fighting the fading light to patch a tear in a boy's wool coat. It was the only winter coat the Miller boy owned. His mother had confessed with red-rimmed eyes, and he could not go to school without it. Lydia worked the thick gray fabric with a determination that made her fingers ache. She reinforced the elbows, stitching not just for utility, but with a kind of fierce prayer that the thread would hold against the cold. She paused, rubbing her hands together to chase away the stiffness. The stove in the center of the shop was a black-bellied beast that devoured wood but gave back little heat to the corners. Through the glass, she watched the street. It was a river of frozen mud and ruts. A wagon lumbered past, the horse's breath pluming like steam engines. "You have a steady hand, Mrs. Marsh, Mrs." Gable said, looking up from her ledger. She was a bird-like woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Better than the last girl I had, she lacked patience. Patience is a necessity, not a virtue, Lydia replied, keeping her eyes on her work. "You speak like someone who has had to wait out a storm or two, Mrs., Gable observed. And you speak well, too well for a simple seamstress from— where did you say you were from again? Ohio?" Lydia felt the familiar tighten in her chest, the old reflex to run. "Pennsylvania," she lied smoothly. "My father was a schoolteacher. He insisted on proper grammar." "Is that so, Mrs.?" Gable hummed, not entirely convinced. "Well, the town is talking, in a good way, mostly. They say you do fine work, though Mrs. Higgins at the Mercantile says you are awful quiet. Says you walk like you are afraid the ground might open up." "I am a private person," Lydia said, biting off the thread. She was not just private. She was invisible by design. She avoided the church socials, pleading fatigue. She walked with her head down, her bonnet pulled forward to shadow her face. She knew the danger of being seen. Men were beginning to watch her, the way she moved, the straight line of her back. She saw the calculation in their eyes, the wondering. Is she lonely? Is she desperate? Is she loose? Every Friday, she went to the post office. It was the one risk she took. She purchased a postal order for $3, a significant portion of her earnings, and mailed it to a convent in St. Louis. She included no letter, only the money. It was penance. It was a lifeline. It was the only thing that proved she was still human, that there was a piece of her soul she had not sold in the mining camps. But the questions were starting. She could feel the curiosity of the town pressing in like the cold, 5 miles out of town, on the wind-scoured range of the Double Bar Ranch. Eli Mercer was fighting a war against the wire. The Double Bar was a small outfit, run by a cripple named Old Man O'Malley, who had too much pride and not enough hands. Eli had signed on for the winter, taking the wages of a common hand because it kept him busy and kept him close to redemption without being right in the middle of it. The wind out here was ferocious. It shrieked down from the granite peaks, driving ice crystals into Eli's skin until his face felt raw. He dismounted, his boots crunching through the snow crust, and grabbed his fencing pliers. Silas Carver's cattle were drifting again. "Damn it," Eli muttered, seeing the broken strands of barbed wire. It wasn't the snow that had snapped the wire. It was cutters. Carver's men had ridden through here, snipping the fence to let their steers push onto O'Malley's winter grazing. It was an old trick, one Eli knew well. He had seen it done 100 times when he rode for Carver. Starve the small man out, eat his grass, and then offer to buy his land for pennies on the dollar when he went bust. Eli grabbed the loose end of the wire, wrestling it back toward the cedar post. The metal bit into his leather gloves. His knuckles, already scarred and swollen from the cold, protested the strain. He hated this. He hated the bullying. He hated that he recognized the tactics because he had once been the one executing them. He looked south, toward the ridge where Carver's massive herd was massing like a storm cloud. He could see the dark shapes of the cattle against the white snow, thousands of them, and behind them, the shadow of Silas Carver, a man who believed the world belonged to him simply because he had the strength to take it. Eli twisted the wire, securing it with a savage torque of his wrist. He was trying to be a different man. He was trying to wash the blood off his conscience with honest sweat. But the past had a way of circling back, just like a hungry coyote. He thought of the woman from the stagecoach, Lena. He had seen her a few times in town when he went in for supplies. She always looked like she was holding her breath. He wanted to talk to her, to ask her if her cheek had healed, but he stayed away. He sensed that she was a creature made of glass, and he was a man made of stone. If he got too close, he would only break her. And yet, he couldn't shake the memory of her eyes. They were the eyes of someone who had seen the bottom of the well. "Come on, Buster," Eli said to his horse, swinging back into the frozen saddle. "Let us finish this line before the weather turns. Sky looks like it wants to bury us." The storm hit late in the afternoon, rolling off the mountains with a speed that caught the valley off guard. One moment the sky was a dull iron gray. The next, it was a swirling white chaos. Eli had ridden into town to pick up nails and flour for the ranch. By the time he tied Buster in front of the livery, the main street of Redemption was disappearing. The wind was gusting at 40 miles an hour, driving the snow horizontally. He pulled his hat low, squinting against the sting, and headed toward the general store. That was when he saw her. Lydia was in the middle of the street, struggling. She had evidently been crossing from the freight depot to the dressmaker's shop, carrying 3 heavy bolts of wool fabric. The wind had caught the cloth, unfurling the top bolt like a sail. It whipped around her, tangling her legs, threatening to drag her down into the freezing mud. She looked small and terrifyingly fragile against the violence of the storm. Her bonnet had been blown back, hanging by its ribbons, and her hair was whipping across her face. "Let go of it!" Eli shouted, though the wind tore the words away. She didn't let go. She fought the wind, clutching the fabric as if it were gold. It was not her cloth, it was Mrs. Gable's, and Lydia knew she would have to pay for it if it was ruined. She could not afford to pay. She slipped, one knee going down into the slush. Eli moved. He didn't think. He just launched himself off the boardwalk, splashing through the muck. He reached her in 3 long strides. He didn't ask. He simply stepped in front of her, placing his broad back to the wind, creating a sudden, calm pocket of air. He reached down and grabbed the bolts of cloth from her freezing hands. "I have got it," he growled. Lydia gasped. Looking up, Eli Mercer loomed over her, a dark tower of wet canvas and leather. He hoisted the heavy bolts onto his shoulder with one hand and reached out with the other to grip her elbow. "Up," he commanded. "Get inside before you freeze to death." He hauled her to her feet. The wind slammed into his back, but he didn't budge. He steered her toward the general store, shielding her body with his own. For a moment, they were pressed together. Lydia stumbled, and Eli's arm tightened around her waist to steady her. She felt the heat of him through her thin coat, a solid, radiating warmth that shocked her system. It was the heat of a living thing, a protector. Her breath hitched. For 3 years, the touch of a man had meant demand, ownership, pain, but this was just shelter. She hated how much she wanted to lean into it. She hated the sudden weakness in her knees that had nothing to do with the cold. They burst through the door of the general store, the bell jingling frantically. Eli kicked the door shut behind them, cutting off the howl of the wind. Silence fell, heavy and sudden. Lydia sagged against the counter, her chest heaving. She brushed the wet hair from her face, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Eli dropped the bolts of cloth on the counter. He was covered in snow, his duster white, his beard frosted. He looked at her, his gray eyes searching. "You hurt?" he asked. "No," Lydia managed to say, though her teeth were chattering. I just lost my footing. Thank you." "Fool thing to be doing, carrying that much sail in a gale," Eli muttered, brushing the snow from his sleeves. "I had to get them," Lydia said defensively. Mrs. Gable was waiting. The door opened again, and Constable Miller blew in, followed by a gust of snow that coated the floorboards. He struggled to close the door, leaning his shoulder against it until the latch clicked. Mercer, the constable wheezed, wiping his spectacles. I saw your horse at the livery. You are not planning on riding back to the Double Bar tonight, are you? That was the plan, Eli said. Forget it, Miller said flatly. The pass is already drifted over, 5 feet deep and climbing. You ride out there. They will find you in the spring when the thaw comes, if the wolves do not find you first. Eli looked out the window. It was a wall of white. He cursed softly under his breath. Looks like you are stuck, son. The shopkeeper, Mr. Higgins, said from behind the counter. I would offer you a room, but the hotel is full up with cattle buyers. Mrs. Higgins, a round woman with a kind face, bustled out from the back room. Nonsense. He cannot sleep in the stable. It is going to be 10 below zero tonight. Eli, you can take the cot in the back of the store. We need someone to keep an eye on the stove anyway. Make sure the pipes do not freeze. Lydia froze. She rented the room directly above the store. The floorboards were thin. The staircase was open. I could sleep at the livery, Eli offered. Glancing at Lydia, he saw the tension in her jaw. Do not be proud. Mrs., Higgins scolded. You saved Mrs. Marsh from being blown to Kansas. You take the cot. I will not have a frozen cowboy on my conscience. Eli looked at Lydia. He seemed to be waiting for her to object. Lydia swallowed hard. She could not object. It wasn't her store. And he had just pulled her out of the mud. Mrs. Higgins is right, Lydia said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. It is too dangerous to ride. So it was settled. The trap was sprung by the weather. Night fell, bringing with it a darkness that felt absolute. The town of Redemption hunkered down. The wind did not stop. It intensified. It screamed around the eaves of the building, rattling the window panes like a madman trying to break in, upstairs, in her small room. Lydia lay in her narrow bed buried under 3 quilts. Fully dressed, she was shaking. It wasn't just the cold. It was the sound. The howling wind triggered memories she fought every day to suppress. It took her back to Silver Creek, to the shacks with paper-thin walls, to the nights when storms would rage and the miners, drunk and bored and trapped by the weather, would get mean. She remembered the sound of boots on the stairs, the sound of the door latch lifting, the feeling of having nowhere to run because the world outside was death. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hands over her ears. I am Lena Marsh, she chanted silently. I am a seamstress. I am safe. But she wasn't safe. There was a man downstairs, a cowboy, a man who had ridden for Carver, a man with hands that could snap wire and break horses. The floorboards creaked below. He was moving. Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs. She couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt stale, suffocating. She needed heat. She needed to be near the fire, or the ice inside her would never melt. She threw off the quilts, wrapping a thick wool shawl around her shoulders. She opened her door and crept into the hallway. The stairs descended into the black pit of the store. She moved silently, her stocking feet making no sound. At the bottom of the stairs, the red glow of the pot-belly stove cut through the gloom. Eli was there. He wasn't asleep. He was sitting on a crate near the stove, his back to her, staring into the open grate. He had shed his heavy duster and vest. He sat in his shirt sleeves, his elbows on his knees, his head hanging low. He looked diminished. Not the giant who had blocked the wind, but a man carrying a heavy load. Lydia stepped closer, seeking the warmth. A floorboard groaned under her weight. Eli spun around, his hand instinctively going to his hip, though he wasn't wearing his gun belt. When he saw her, he relaxed, letting out a long breath. Easy, he said softly. Thought you were a ghost. I could not sleep, Lydia said. She hugged the shawl tighter. The cold. It is a bad one, Eli agreed. He looked at her. In the firelight, her face was pale, her eyes wide and dark. She was trembling violently. You are freezing, he said. He stood up. He picked up his heavy sheepskin coat from where it lay on the counter. Here, put this on. No, Lydia said, stepping back. I am fine. You are shaking apart, Mrs. "Marsh," Eli said. He held the coat out. "It is clean, mostly." Lydia looked at the coat. It smelled of sage, tobacco, and horse. It smelled like a man. But the cold was biting into her bones. She took it. She slipped her arms into the sleeves. The coat was massive on her, engulfing her frame. But the warmth was instant. It held his body heat. It felt like an embrace, and that terrified her more than the cold. She moved to the stove, holding her hands out to the iron. "Thank you," she said stiffly. "Wind keeps you up?" Eli asked. He sat back down on the crate, giving her space. "It sounds like—" She stopped. "It sounds like a mining camp." Eli watched her profile. The firelight danced on her high cheekbones, illuminating the faint, pink line of the scar on her cheek where the glass had cut her. "Mining camps are rough places for a lady," he said carefully. Lydia let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Lady. That is a word men use when they want to pretend they are civilized." She turned to look at him, her defenses suddenly spiking. The fear turned to anger, a safer emotion. "You cowboys are all the same," she snapped. The words spilled out, acid and raw. "You drift into town, you play the hero, you drink the whiskey, and you take what you want. And when the storm clears, you ride off and leave the mess behind for someone else to clean up." Eli flinched. The accusation hit a mark she hadn't even intended to aim for. "Is that what you think I am?" he asked quietly. "Just another drifter looking to take something?" "You worked for Carver?" Lydia said. It was an accusation. "You rode for a man who burns families out of their homes. You think because you fixed a fence today, it washes that off?" Eli looked down at his hands. He turned them over, looking at the calluses, the scars. "No," he said. His voice was rough. "I do not think it washes off. I do not think it ever washes off." He looked up at her, his expression open, stripped of its usual guard. "I rode for him," Eli admitted. "For 2 years. I was young, and the pay was good. I did not ask questions. I delivered letters. I moved cattle. And then I saw what happened when the orders were carried out." He paused, the fire popping in the silence. "I saw a sodbuster's barn burn down," Eli said. "I saw a man beaten half to death for refusing to sell his water rights. And I saw—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "I realized I was holding the hammer, even if I wasn't swinging it. So I quit. I walked away. But walking away does not undo the damage." Lydia stared at him. She heard the truth in his voice. It resonated with the hollow ache in her own chest. "They ruin you," she whispered. "Men like Carver, they take everything you are, and they turn it into something small and dirty, and they make you believe you deserved it." She wasn't talking about Carver anymore. She was talking about every man who had bought her time in Silver Creek. Eli looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the cracks in the armor. He saw the woman who had been broken, not just the widow who sewed dresses. "Nobody deserves that," Eli said firmly. "Nobody." The air between them shifted. The hostility evaporated, replaced by a heavy, charged silence. They were 2 wounded animals circling the same fire, recognizing the limp in each other's gait. "I made some coffee," Eli said, breaking the tension. He reached for a tin pot sitting on the top of the stove. "It is strong enough to float a horseshoe, but it is hot." He poured a cup and held it out to her. Lydia reached for it. Her hand was still shaking. As she took the cup, her fingers brushed against his. The contact was electric. They both froze. Lydia felt a jolt go up her arm, a sudden, piercing awareness of him. His skin was rough, warm. He was so close. She could smell the soap he used, the scent of the wood smoke. She looked up. Eli was staring at her lips. His eyes were dark, dilated. For a second, just a second, the hunger was there. Not the cheap, grasping hunger of the customers in the brothel, but a deep, starving longing, a desire to hold and be held. Lydia felt her own breath catch. She wanted him to touch her. The thought shocked her. She wanted him to wrap those strong arms around her and block out the wind and the memories. Eli saw the fear flare in her eyes alongside the want. He blinked, breaking the spell. He forced himself to look away, pulling his hand back as if burned. "Careful," he rasped. "It is hot." Lydia retreated a step, clutching the cup with both hands. Her heart was racing so fast she felt dizzy. Boom! A massive sound shook the building. Lydia screamed, dropping the cup. Coffee splashed onto the floorboards. It was just the snow, a heavy shelf of ice sliding off the steep metal roof and crashing onto the boardwalk outside with the force of a gunshot. But to Lydia, in that state of raw nerves, it sounded like a door being kicked in. It sounded like a gunshot. She buckled, covering her head, a cry of pure terror ripping from her throat. "Lydia!" Eli shouted, using her real name, though neither of them noticed. He moved on instinct. He caught her before she hit the floor. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her upright, pulling her against him. "It is okay," he said, his voice a rumble against her ear. "It is just the snow. It is just the roof. You are safe. I have got you." Lydia was shaking so hard her teeth rattled. She didn't fight him. She couldn't. The terror had hollowed her out. She let herself lean into him. She buried her face in the flannel of his shirt. She felt his chest rise and fall. She felt the steady, powerful thump of his heart against her cheek. It was a rhythm of life, of solidity. For a long, suspended moment, she stayed there. She let him hold her. She let herself be weak. She felt his hand come up to cradle the back of her head. His fingers tangled in her loose hair. He held her as if she were precious, as if she were something worth saving. The warmth of him soaked into her. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. Then, reality rushed back in. She was standing in the dark, in her nightdress, under his coat, in the arms of a man she barely knew. A man who knew who she was, a man who had seen the truth. Lydia pulled back, gasping. She pushed against his chest. I'm sorry," she stammered. She stepped out of his reach, her face burning with shame. "I did not mean to—" "Lydia," Eli said, reaching a hand out. "Do not," she said, backing toward the stairs. She stripped off his heavy coat and let it fall to the floor. "Do not look at me." She turned and fled. She ran up the stairs, her feet stumbling, desperate to get back to the safety of her lock and key. Eli stood alone by the stove. He watched her go. He heard the door upstairs slam shut, heard the slide of the bolt. He looked down at his coat lying in a heap on the floor. He looked at his hand, the one that had held her. He knew now. He knew who she was. The name Lydia had slipped out of his memory and onto his tongue. Lydia Kane, the rancher's daughter, the girl whose life had been dismantled by the very orders he had carried. And he knew something else. He knew that the pain he saw in her was a mirror of his own. Eli sank back onto the crate. He didn't sleep that night. He sat listening to the wind and the fire, wondering how a man could fix something so broken, when he was the one holding the hammer. The winter deepened, clamping down on the Valley of Redemption like a vice made of iron and gray sky. The days grew short, the sun barely scraping the tops of the southern peaks before sinking again, leaving the town submerged in a twilight that lasted half the morning and began again in the mid-afternoon. Life in the town slowed to the rhythm of survival. Men spent their hours hauling cordwood from the lower slopes, their breath steaming in the frigid air, or breaking the ice on the watering troughs with heavy hammers. Women kept their stoves fed, the smell of wood smoke and boiling chicory coffee becoming the permanent perfume of the settlement. It was a time of waiting, waiting for the thaw, waiting for the supplies to run low, waiting for the silence to break. But beneath the stillness, a different kind of pressure was building. Silas Carver was not a man to let winter stop ambition. His cattle, thousands of head bearing the sprawling SC brand, began to drift closer to the town limits. They were hungry, pushing through the deep drifts in search of forage, and Carver's riders were pushing them harder, driving them onto land that belonged to the smallholders and homesteaders of the valley. Eli Mercer saw it first. He was riding the perimeter of the O'Malley place, his coat collar turned up against a wind that carried needles of ice. He spotted a group of riders near the creek, Carver's men, cutting a wire fence to let a herd of 50 steers onto a patch of winter wheat that belonged to a farmer named Elias Thorne. Eli spurred his horse. Buster, down the slope. As he drew closer, he recognized the man holding the wire cutters. It was Hank Dobbs. Dobbs was a brute of a man, thick-necked and small-eyed, with a reputation for enjoying his work too much. He had been a low-level enforcer when Eli rode for Carver, the kind of man who would kick a dog just to hear it yelp. "You are trespassing, Dobbs," Eli called out, pulling Buster to a halt 10 yards away. His hand rested casually near the revolver on his hip, though he did not draw it. Dobbs looked up, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. He grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. "Well, if it is not the saint of the sagebrush. Mercer, heard you were playing nursemaid to a cripple these days." "Put the wire up, Hank," Eli said, his voice flat. "Thorne needs that wheat for the spring." "Thorne is a squatter on Mr. Carver's range," Dobbs sneered. "These cows need to eat." He stepped forward, raising the cutters threateningly toward the cowering farmer. Thorne, who stood by his porch with a pitchfork. "Get back inside, sodbuster, before I prune you like a rosebush." Eli moved his horse forward, blocking Dobbs's path. The animal was big, and Eli knew how to use its weight. He crowded Dobbs, forcing the man to step back or be trampled. "I said leave it be," Eli warned. "You cut that fence, and the constable will have a word with you. And if he does not, I will." Dobbs stared at Eli, measuring the distance, measuring the threat. He saw the cold capability in Eli's eyes, the look of a man who knew exactly how much pressure it took to break a bone. Dobbs laughed, a harsh, barking sound, and lowered the cutters. "You are making a mistake. Mercer," Dobbs said, "you are standing on the wrong side of the landslide, Mr. Carver remembers his friends. He remembers his enemies better." "Right on, Hank," Eli said. Dobbs signaled his men. They turned their horses, leaving the fence uncut but the threat hanging heavy in the air. As they rode off, Eli watched them go, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. The sharks were circling. That evening, the dressmaker's shop was dim, lit only by the kerosene lamps that cast long, wavering shadows against the walls hung with patterns and half-finished garments. Lydia sat in her corner, her eyes straining over a bolt of dark blue serge. Mrs. Gable was chatting with Mrs. Higgins, the shopkeeper's wife, who had come in to warm herself by the stove. "It is getting worse." "Mrs." Higgins whispered, though there was no one else in the shop but Lydia. "My husband says Carver's men were in the saloon last night, drinking and carrying on. One of them, that foreman, Hank Dobbs, he knocked over a table and refused to pay for the breakage." Lydia froze. The needle in her hand hovered over the fabric. Dobbs. The name struck her like a physical blow. She knew that name. She knew the face that went with it, a heavy, sweating face, eyes that stripped a woman bare, a voice that demanded things no woman should have to give. Hank Dobbs had been a regular at the Velvet Slipper in Silver Creek. He was a man who liked to hurt. "They say he is a beast." Mrs. Gable clucked, shaking her head. "I tell you, this town is not safe with men like that roaming the streets." Lydia forced her hand to move, to push the needle through the cloth, but her heart was hammering against her ribs. If Dobbs was here, really here, her time was running out. He had seen her 100 times. He knew her face. He knew her shame. She kept her head down, praying that the shadows would keep her secret a little longer. The bell above the door jingled, loud and cheerful, announcing a new arrival. A man walked in. He was not a local. He wore a fine wool suit under a buffalo coat, a silk vest, and a hat that was brushed clean of dust. He had the smooth, polished look of a riverboat gambler or a funeral director. His eyes were sharp, dark beads that scanned the room with a predatory intelligence. "Good evening, ladies," the man said. His voice was smooth, like oil on water. Lydia did not look up. She sensed the danger radiating from him. A different kind of danger than the brute force of Dobbs. This was a man who used words like knives. "Good evening, sir, Mrs." Gable said, straightening her apron. "Can I help you?" "I am hoping so," the man said, stepping further into the light. "My name is Miles Rourke. I am in town on business, buying cattle, mostly. But a man gets lonely on the road, and I find myself in need of a new shirt. Something with a bit of style. The local general store seems to stock only burlap sacks." Lydia's blood ran cold. Miles Rourke. She knew him. He was a parasite who attached himself to powerful men. He had been a friend of Silas Carver, often seen drinking in the private parlors of the wealthy, but he also frequented the darker corners of the mining towns. He had been in the saloon in Silver Creek the night her life had finally shattered. He had watched her with those dead, shark-like eyes. She hunched her shoulders, making herself smaller, terrified that he would look into her corner. "We can certainly measure you, Mr. Rourke." "Mrs." Gable said, flustered by the man's apparent wealth. "Excellent," Rourke said. He walked toward the counter, his gaze sweeping the room. He didn't seem to notice the woman in the shadows, or perhaps she was just part of the furniture to him. Just then, the door opened again. Eli Mercer walked in, stomping snow from his boots. He was there to pick up a mended jacket. "Evening, Mrs. Gable," Eli said, his voice low and rumbly. "Mr. Mercer." "Mrs." Gable said. "Just a moment." Rourke turned to look at Eli. A flicker of recognition passed over the gambler's face, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned his attention back to the women, clearly enjoying the audience. "It is a dreary town you have here," Rourke commented, leaning against the counter. "Reminds me of a place I passed through up north. Silver Creek. Now there was a town with some life in it." Lydia's hand trembled. She gripped the fabric so hard her knuckles turned white. "Is that so, Mrs.?" Higgins asked politely. "Oh, yes," Rourke chuckled. "Rough place, full of miners and desperate characters. But they had their amusements. I knew a girl there. Beautiful thing. She had the face of an angel and the morals of an alley cat. Went from a fine ranch house to a crib out back in less than a year." He laughed, a cruel, dry sound. It is amazing how fast quality can fall when the money runs out. The needle in Lydia's hand slipped. It drove deep into the pad of her thumb. She gasped, a sharp intake of breath she couldn't suppress. The pain was sudden and sharp, but it was nothing compared to the sickness roiling in her stomach. A drop of bright red blood welled up and smeared onto the pale blue fabric. The sound drew eyes. Eli looked toward her corner instantly. He saw her recoil, saw the hand fly to her mouth. He saw the terror in her eyes, not the fear of a pricked finger, but the terror of a hunted animal hearing the trap snap shut. "Mrs. Marsh?" Eli took a step toward her. "Are you all right?" Rourke turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the dim corner. Lydia scrambled to her feet. I am fine," she stammered. Her voice was high, brittle. The needle." "Let me see," Eli said, moving closer, his concern genuine. "No!" Lydia snapped. She backed away, clutching her hand to her chest. "Leave me alone. It is none of your concern." She grabbed her shawl and fled toward the back room, the door slamming behind her with a force that shook the walls. The silence in the shop was heavy. "High-strung woman," Rourke murmured. He was staring at the closed door, his head tilted to the side, a look of calculating curiosity on his face. "Mrs. Marsh, you said?" "Yes, Mrs." Gable said, looking worriedly at the smear of blood on the serge. "She is a widow. Very quiet, usually." "A widow," Rourke repeated. He smiled, a slow, ugly curving of his lips. "Interesting." Eli looked from the door to Rourke. He didn't like the man. He didn't like the suit. He didn't like the smile. And he didn't like the way the man was looking at the back room as if he were mentally undressing the woman inside. "She is tired," Eli said, his voice hard. "Leave it be." Rourke turned his gaze to Eli. "I did not say a word. Friend, just making observation." Later that night, the wind died down. leaving the air still and brittle with cold. Rourke walked down the boardwalk, his boots crunching on the packed snow. He had spent the last 2 hours in the Lucky Strike saloon, drinking whiskey that was surprisingly decent for such a backwater hole. He was in a good mood. He had business with Carver in 2 days. But for now, he had time to kill. He passed the dressmaker's shop. It was dark, closed for the night, but as he looked up, he saw a light in the second-floor window. The shade was drawn, but it was thin paper. A silhouette moved against the light. A woman's profile. She was pacing, her head bowed, her hands wringing together. Rourke stopped. He watched the shadow. He knew that shape. He had an eye for women. It was part of his trade. In a way, he remembered the way a woman held herself. The memory clicked into place. The widow in the shop, the voice, the terror in her eyes when he mentioned Silver Creek. And now, the silhouette. Well, Rourke whispered to the empty street. A plume of white breath escaped his lips. Lila, little Lila from the Velvet Slipper. He remembered her well. She had been the prize of the house for a short time. High-strung, yes, but that was part of the appeal for some men. They liked to break things. He smiled, reaching into his pocket for a cigar. He struck a match on the shop siding, the flare illuminating his face for a brief second. Lena Marsh, he chuckled. You cannot hide under a new bonnet. Sweetheart, not from me. The next morning broke gray and frigid. Lydia had not slept. Every creak of the building had sounded like footsteps on the stairs. She felt exposed, skinless. She had to work. She needed the money. If she was going to run again, she needed every cent. At 10 o'clock, she took a bucket of ashes from the stove to dump in the alley behind the shop. It was a mundane task, one that grounded her. The cold air bit at her face as she stepped out the back door. The smell of stable muck and wood smoke heavy in the narrow space between the buildings. She dumped the ashes onto the pile, the gray dust swirling in the breeze. Morning, Lila? The voice came from the shadows near the stack of firewood. Lydia dropped the bucket. It clattered against the frozen ground, the sound echoing like a gunshot. She spun around. Miles Rourke was leaning against the wall, picking his teeth with a sliver of wood. He was smiling, but his eyes were dead. My name is Lena, Lydia whispered, backing up until her spine hit the rough wood of the shop wall. Save it, Rourke said, pushing off the wall. He walked toward her, slow and deliberate. I know who you are. I know where you came from, and I know what you cost. He stopped 2 feet from her, crowding her space. He smelled of stale whiskey and bay rum. Please, Lydia said, her voice shaking. I am just trying to live. I am not hurting anyone. You are living a lie, Rourke said. Folks in this town, they are church-going people, aren't they? They do not take kindly to whores living above their general store. Imagine what they would say if they knew the widow Marsh was really Lila, the girl who would do anything for a $5 gold piece. Lydia felt bile rise in her throat. I am not that woman anymore. You are whatever I say you are, Rourke hissed. He reached out, his hand grasping a lock of her hair that had escaped her bonnet. He rubbed the strands between his fingers. Unless you convince me to keep my mouth shut. I have no money, Lydia said. I have nothing. Oh, you have something, Rourke said, his gaze dropping to her chest, then back to her eyes. You have always had something. I figure $20 to keep the secret, and maybe a little private time, for old time's sake. He leaned in, his face close to hers. Tonight, my room at the hotel, or I start talking to every old biddy in this town before sunset. Lydia's stomach churned. The panic was a white-hot blinding light in her mind. She should scream. She should run. But she was frozen, paralyzed by the shame that he wielded like a weapon. No, she whispered. What did you say? Rourke's face hardened. He slammed his hand against the wall next to her head, trapping her. I said no, Lydia said, louder this time. She looked him in the eye, her terror warring with a desperate, clawing pride. I would rather leave. I would rather walk into the snow than let you touch me." "Is that right?" Rourke sneered. He grabbed her shoulder, his fingers digging into the wool of her coat. "You think you have a choice, you little—" "Get your hands off her!" The voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that cut through the air like a razor. Rourke froze. He turned his head. Eli Mercer stood at the mouth of the alley. He had been coming from the livery, a bale of hay on one shoulder. He had dropped the bale in the snow. He stood with his arms loose at his sides, but his body was coiled. "This is a private conversation. Friend," Rourke said, keeping his hand on Lydia's shoulder. "Walk away." Eli didn't walk away. He walked forward. His boots made no sound on the snow now. He moved with a terrifying quietness. "I said," Eli repeated, stopping arm's length from them. "Get your hands off her." Rourke laughed, a nervous, jagged sound. "Or what? You gonna shoot me, cowboy, over a whore?" The word hung in the air. Eli moved. It was a blur of motion. He didn't go for a gun. He stepped in, his left hand lashing out to grab Rourke's wrist, the one holding Lydia. Eli twisted. He didn't just pull, he torqued the joint against its natural rotation. Rourke yelped, a high-pitched sound of pain, and his grip on Lydia broke. "You son of a—" Rourke tried to swing with his other hand. Eli ducked under the clumsy haymaker. He drove his shoulder into Rourke's chest, slamming the gambler back against the brick wall of the general store. The impact knocked the wind out of Rourke with a guttural whoosh. It wasn't a duel. It was a brawl. It was dirty and fast. Rourke tried to knee Eli in the groin. Eli caught the blow on his thigh and countered with a short, brutal right hook to Rourke's gut. Rourke doubled over. Eli grabbed him by the collar of his fine buffalo coat and threw him sideways. Rourke slipped in the dirty snow and muck, crashing down hard on his hands and knees. His hat flew off, landing in a puddle of frozen horse urine. Eli stood over him, breathing hard, his fists clenched. "Get up," Eli growled. "Get up and I will finish it." Rourke scrambled backward, crab walking through the slush. He was gasping for air, his face red, his fine clothes ruined. He looked at Eli, and for the first time, he saw that he had miscalculated. This wasn't a town protector. This was a man who had done violence for a living. "You are crazy," Rourke wheezed, clutching his stomach. He struggled to his feet, backing away toward the street. "You are protecting garbage. Mercer, you do not even know." "I know enough," Eli said. He took a step forward. "She is a whore," Rourke shouted, spitting blood onto the snow. Ask her about the velvet slipper. You are fighting for a woman who has been had by half the territory." Eli didn't stop. He walked toward Rourke with the inexorable pace of a glacier. Rourke turned and ran. He stumbled out of the alley and onto the main street, disappearing around the corner. Silence rushed back into the alley, heavy and suffocating. Lydia stood pressed against the wall. Her hands were covering her mouth. She was shaking so hard the fabric of her coat vibrated. Eli stood with his back to her for a long moment. He watched the empty space where Rourke had been. He flexed his hands, the knuckles raw from the impact. Slowly, he turned to face her. "Lydia," he said softly. The sound of her name, her real name, or at least the one he used, snapped something inside her. "Why did you do that?" she cried out. It wasn't gratitude, it was fury. She pushed herself off the wall, her eyes blazing with tears and rage. "Why did you have to interfere? Why couldn't you just leave it alone?" Eli blinked, stunned. "He was hurting you. He was blackmailing you. And now he will tell everyone," Lydia screamed. Her voice cracked. "He will tell the whole town, as long as it was just him. I could have handled it. I could have paid him, or run, or—" "But now you have made a scene. You have made it a fight." "You were going to pay him?" Eli asked, his voice incredulous. "Lydia, men like that do not stop taking just because you pay them once." "You do not know anything about it," Lydia shouted. She paced in the small space, her hands flying. "You think you are some kind of knight? You think you can just beat up the bad man and everything is fixed? You just shone a light on me. You just pointed a finger at me and said, 'Look here, something is worth fighting for.' So there must be a secret. She stopped in front of him, chest heaving. You did this for yourself. You did this so you could feel like a good man. So you could forget about the barns you burned and the people you hurt for Carver. You used me to clean your own conscience. The words hit Eli like stones. He stood still, his face pale beneath the tan and the beard. That is not true, he said quietly. Isn't it? Lydia demanded. You see a woman in trouble and you think, here is my chance to be a hero. But you do not know what I need. I needed silence. I needed to be invisible. And you just made me the center of attention. I could not let him touch you, Eli said. He said it simply, without anger. I do not care what your past is. I do not care what name you use. I could not watch him put his hands on you. My past? Lydia let out a harsh laugh. You think you know? You heard him. You heard what he called me. I heard, Eli said. I do not care. You should. Lydia stepped closer, her face twisted with pain. You should care, because men like him, and men like Carver, and men like you made me this way. You created the world where I had to sell myself to survive, and now you want to stand there and judge who gets to touch me? She was trembling, on the verge of shattering completely. She wanted to tell him everything. She wanted to vomit the whole ugly truth onto the snow between them. The nights, the smell of whiskey, the dead eyes of men who used her body like a rag. But she stopped. She clamped her jaw shut. The shame was too deep. It was a physical weight she couldn't share. You have no idea who you are talking to, she whispered bitterly. You are defending a ghost. Eli, a dirty, ruined ghost. She turned and ran back toward the door of the shop. She fumbled with the latch, her fingers numb, and threw herself inside, locking the door behind her. Eli stood alone in the alley. The smell of the stable muck was strong. The sky was a flat, indifferent white. He looked at his hands. They were shaking now, the adrenaline fading into a dull ache. He had done the right thing. He knew he had. A man couldn't stand by and watch that. But her words rang in his ears. You did this for yourself. Was it true? Was he just trying to wash the blood of the past off his hands by playing the savior? He kicked the snow, a burst of frustration. He didn't know. All he knew was that when Rourke had touched her, Eli had felt a rage so pure and white-hot it had scared him. That night, Lydia sat in her room. She did not light the lamp. She sat by the window, wrapped in a quilt, staring out at the frozen street below. The town was quiet. The wind whispered around the eaves. She felt sick. She felt terrified. Rourke was out there. He would talk. Tomorrow, the whispers would start. The looks, the women pulling their skirts aside when she passed. She should pack. She should leave tonight. But she didn't move. She touched her shoulder where Rourke had grabbed her. It still ached. Then she thought of the alley. She thought of Eli Mercer. She replayed the moment he had stepped in, the way he had looked, not at Rourke, but at her. The absolute, unhesitating way he had moved to put himself between her and the threat. I do not care what your past is. He had said it like he meant it. Lydia closed her eyes. She felt two things warring inside her. One was the old, familiar fear, the knowledge that exposure meant destruction. Eli had hastened that exposure, and for that, she was furious. But the other feeling was new. It was a warmth that pooled low in her belly. It was the memory of his hands, violent against Rourke, but protective of her. It was the realization that for the first time in years, a man had fought for her, not over her. She felt safer knowing he was in town, and she felt more endangered than ever because he was the one man who could hurt her not with violence, but by making her want something she could never have. She pressed her hand to the cold glass. Eli, she whispered into the dark. She hated him. She needed him. And she knew that tomorrow, when the sun rose over the snow-blind mountains, everything was going to change. The hiding was over. The storm was here. Miles Rourke sat at a corner table in the Lucky Strike, nursing a bruise on his jaw that had turned the color of a spoiling plum. A glass of whiskey sat before him, amber and oily in the lantern light. He was not a man accustomed to losing, and certainly not to a saddle tramp like Eli Mercer. The physical pain was a dull throb, but the injury to his pride was a sharp, festering wound that demanded a reckoning. He did not shout his accusations from the bar top. Rourke was too clever for that. He let the poison drip out slowly, drop by calculated drop. He spoke to the bartender in a voice just loud enough to be overheard by the men playing faro at the next table. He leaned in close to the shopkeeper, Mr. Higgins, when he bought a cigar, offering a knowing smirk and a rhetorical question about the new widow in town. "It is a shame," Rourke murmured, swirling his drink. "A woman with a face like that ending up in a place like this. I saw her up in Silver Creek, you know. She was quite the attraction at the Velvet Slipper. Of course, they called her Lila then. $5 for the night, if I recall correctly. Though toward the end, I hear the price dropped." The words drifted through the smoky air of the saloon, catching in the ears of men who were bored, cold, and hungry for scandal. They were repeated in the livery stable while horses were curried. They were whispered over fences while wood was chopped. They made their way into the kitchens where wives kneaded dough, transforming from rumors into hard, ugly facts as they traveled. Within 3 days, the atmosphere in Redemption shifted. It was not a sudden storm, but a creeping frost. Lydia felt it first on the boardwalk. She was carrying a finished calico dress to the miller's wife, walking with her head down against the biting wind. 2 women she knew, women who had smiled and asked about her health just a week ago, saw her coming. They did not speak. They did not nod. They gathered their skirts and stepped deliberately into the doorway of the assay office, turning their backs until she passed. Lydia kept walking, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She told herself she was imagining it. She told herself it was just the cold, but then she passed the barber shop. 3 men were standing outside, smoking pipes. As she approached, their conversation died. They watched her. It was not the casual observation of before. It was a heavy, speculative stare. One of them, a ranch hand with a broken nose, let his eyes drag over her slowly, from her boots to the collar of her coat, a look of cheap, assessing hunger that made her skin crawl. He whispered something to his companion, and they both snickered, a low, wet sound that followed her down the street. She reached the dressmaker's shop, her hands trembling so badly she could barely work the latch. She slipped inside, leaning back against the door, breathing hard as if she had just outrun a pack of wolves. "Mrs." Gable was behind the counter, arranging spools of thread. She looked up, her face pinched and unhappy. She did not offer her usual greeting. "Mrs. Marsh." "Mrs." Gable said, her voice tight. "I need to speak with you." Lydia froze. "Is something wrong with the work? Mrs. Gable?" "The work is fine," the older woman said, refusing to meet Lydia's eyes. "It is the circumstances. Mrs. Pembroke came in this morning. She canceled the order for her daughter's wedding quilt." "Canceled?" Lydia asked, her stomach dropping. "But I have already cut the fabric. I have put in hours of—" "She said she does not want you touching it." "Mrs. Gable interrupted, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "She said she heard talk about Silver Creek, about a saloon." Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. The room seemed to tilt. That is just gossip. Idle talk from a stranger." "Is it?" Mrs. Gable looked at her then, her eyes searching, pleading for a denial that rang true. "This is a decent town. Mrs. Marsh, I have a reputation. I cannot have customers thinking I employ fallen women. You understand that, don't you?" "I understand," Lydia whispered. "I am not turning you out." "Mrs." Gable said, wringing her hands. "Not in the middle of winter. I am a Christian woman, but you need to keep a lower profile. Stay in the back. Do not go out unless you have to. And if this talk does not die down—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Lydia retreated to her corner, the shame burning hot in her throat. Keep a lower profile. It was another shove into the shadows, another command to hide, to shrink, to disappear. She sat on her stool, picking up a needle. But her eyes were blinded by tears she refused to let fall. She was trapped. The walls of the shop, the walls of the town, the walls of the valley. They were all closing in. Eli Mercer heard the talk 2 days later. He was in the general store, buying a sack of coffee, when he heard Rourke holding court by the stove. "I tell you," Rourke was saying to a captive audience of 2 farmers, "you can tell by the walk. A woman does not learn to walk like that in Sunday school. That is a walk learned on a sawdust floor." The farmers chuckled, uneasy but titillated. Eli felt a rage so sudden and pure it nearly blinded him. His hand dropped to the Colt on his hip. He wanted to walk over there and pistol whip the smile off Rourke's face. He wanted to drag the man out into the snow and break every bone that allowed him to stand upright. But he stopped himself. Violence would only confirm the lie. If he fought for her again, if he killed a man for her, the town would only say it was proof that she was exactly what Rourke said she was. A woman who drove men to blood. It would strip away the last of her agency. He paid for his coffee, his movements stiff and mechanical. He walked out of the store, the cold air hitting his face, but it did nothing to cool the heat in his chest. He had to talk to her. He had to give her a chance to speak, to define herself before the town did it for her. He crossed the street to the dressmaker's shop. The sign in the window said, "Open," but the interior looked dark. He pushed the door open. The bell jingled. A lonely sound, "Mrs." Gable was gone for the day. Only Lydia was there, sitting in the fading gray light of the window, stitching a hem with ferocious, mechanical intensity. She looked up when he entered. Her face was pale, drawn tight over the bones. There were dark circles under her eyes. She looked like a cornered animal waiting for the final blow. "We are closed," she said, her voice brittle. "Lydia," Eli said gently. He closed the door, shutting out the wind. "Don't," she snapped. "Do not use that name. My name is Lena." "The whole town is using the other name. Lena," Eli said, stepping closer. "Rourke is making sure of that." Lydia dropped the fabric. Her hands curled into fists in her lap. "I know what they are saying. I see how they look at me." "You came to look too? You came to see if the rumors are true?" "I came to see if you are all right," Eli said. He took off his hat, holding it in both hands. "I heard what he is saying. It is poison, but silence feeds it. Lydia, if you do not stand up to it, if you do not tell your side—" "My side?" Lydia laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "What side is that, Eli? The side where I tell them I did what I had to do to eat, to keep a roof over my head? Do you think the good ladies of redemption care about why? They only care that I am dirty." "You are not dirty," Eli said firmly. "Stop it." Lydia stood up, knocking her stool over. "Stop pretending you are noble. You are just like them. You are just curious. You want to know the details, don't you? You want to know if I really was a whore. I want to know who has hold of you." Eli's voice rose, filling the small room. "I want to know what Rourke has on you so we can fight it. I cannot help you fight a ghost I cannot see." "I do not want your help," Lydia shouted. "I would rather be whispered about by every hypocrite in this valley than confess a single thing to you. To a man who rode for Silas Carver." The name hung in the air between them, heavy and toxic. Eli flinched. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a cold, hollow ache. He looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, the desperate pride that held her spine straight even as her world crumbled. "Is that it?" Eli asked quietly. "Is that the wall between us? Carver?" "He is a monster," Lydia spat. "And you took his money. You did his bidding. You helped him break people." "I know," Eli said. He looked down at his hat, his fingers tracing the worn brim. "I know I did, and I have never lied to you about it, but I never hurt a woman, and I never burned a home." "You were part of it," Lydia said, her voice shaking. "You cannot wash that off." "I know," Eli repeated. He looked up, his gray eyes bleak. "I did worse than ride fence. Lydia, I did worse than scare off squatters." Lydia fell silent, watching him. The air in the shop felt suddenly thin, hard to breathe. "I carried orders," Eli said. His voice was a low rumble, rough with the gravel of confession. "Sealed letters. I did not ask what was in them. I just rode one time and 3 years ago. I carried a letter to a foreman near the Bitterroot foothills, a man named Hatcher." Lydia went still. Her breath hitched in her throat. The Bitterroot foothills. That was where her father's ranch had been. "I delivered the letter," Eli continued, staring past her, into the past. "I rode away. 2 days later, I heard about an accident, a wagon accident on the Switchback Trail. A man, a stubborn old rancher who'd been blocking Carver's water access. His wagon went over the edge. Brake failure. They said..." Lydia's hands flew to her mouth. The blood roared in her ears. She remembered that day. She remembered the sheriff standing on their porch, twisting his hat, telling her and her mother that the brakes had snapped. She remembered the wagon, smashed to splinters at the bottom of the ravine. She remembered her father's body, covered by a tarp. "The man died," Eli said, his voice devoid of emotion, as if he were reading a casualty list. "And the letter..." "I found out later the letter was an order to cut the brake line, to make it look like bad luck." Lydia took a step back, her back hitting the shelves of fabric bolts. "No," she whispered. "I did not know," Eli said, his eyes pleading now. "I swear on my mother's grave. Lydia, I did not know what was in that envelope, but I carried it. I put the death warrant in Hatcher's hand, and when I found out, when I realized what I had done, I quit. I rode out that night, but the man was dead, and his family was destroyed." Lydia finished for him. Her voice was a stranger's voice, cold, dead. Eli looked at her, confusion clouding his gaze. "Yes, Carver took the land a month later. The wife and daughter disappeared." Lydia stared at him. The pieces of her shattered life were flying together, forming a picture so grotesque she could barely look at it. "My father," she whispered. Eli froze. "What?" "It was my father," Lydia said. Her voice rose, cracking with the sheer, impossible weight of the truth. "Elias Kane. That was his name. He died on the Switchback Trail in 1885. The brakes failed." Eli went pale. The color drained from his face until he looked like a corpse standing upright. He swayed slightly. "Lydia, no." "You!" Lydia gasped. The shock was giving way to a fury that was white-hot and volcanic. "It was you! You brought the order!" "I did not know," Eli stammered, taking a step toward her. "Lydia, God help me. I did not know it was him. I did not know it was you." "Do not come near me!" Lydia screamed. She grabbed a heavy pair of fabric shears from the counter and held them out, the blades gleaming in the dim light. "You killed him! You killed him just as sure as if you pushed the wagon yourself!" "I am sorry," Eli whispered, his voice broken. "I am so sorry." "Sorry," Lydia laughed, and it sounded like glass breaking. "Sorry does not bring him back. Sorry does not give us back our home. Sorry does not change the fact that because of you, my mother died of a broken heart in a boarding house 6 months later. Sorry does not change the fact that I had to sell myself to men like Rourke just to put her in the ground." She was advancing on him now, the shears trembling in her hand. "You did this. You and Carver. You made me this. You made me a whore." Eli did not back away. He stood there, his arms hanging at his sides, his chest open to her. He looked defeated. He looked like a man who had finally been run to ground by his own sins. "I cannot fix it," he said softly. "I would give my life if I could trade it for his, but I cannot." "Get out," Lydia hissed. "Get out of here. If I ever see you again, I will kill you." Eli looked at her for one long, agonizing moment. He saw the hatred in her eyes, a hatred that mirrored the self-loathing he had carried for 3 years. He nodded once, slowly. "Goodbye, Lydia," he said. He turned and walked out the door. Outside, the world had gone mad. The wind was shrieking down from the mountains, driving the snow sideways in blinding sheets. The landscape was being erased, turned into a blurring vortex of white and gray. Lydia stood in the center of the shop, the shears clattering to the floor from her numb fingers. She wrapped her arms around herself, doubling over as if she had been gutted. The truth was too big. It was too heavy. The man who had saved her from the stagecoach robbery, the man who had held her when the snow fell from the roof, the man whose warmth she had begun to crave, he was the architect of her destruction. She could not stay here. She could not breathe the same air as him. She could not walk down the street and see Rourke smirk and know that Eli Mercer was watching her with pity and guilt. She had to run. It was the only thing she knew how to do. She moved with the frantic energy of the desperate. She ran up the stairs to her room. She grabbed the worn carpet bag. She threw in her 2 dresses, her shawl, the $40 she had saved. She did not fold them. She jammed them in, her hands shaking so hard she could barely work the clasp. She put on every layer of clothing she owned, 2 pairs of stockings, her wool dress, her coat, the scarf Mrs. Gable had given her. She waited until the town was asleep, until the only sound was the howling of the wind. At midnight, she crept down the back stairs. She went out the rear door into the alley where Eli had fought for her honor only hours before. The snow was drifting high against the walls. She made her way to the livery stable. The heavy doors were latched but not locked. She slipped inside, the smell of hay and warm horseflesh hitting her. It was stealing. It was a hanging offense. But she didn't care. She found a horse, a sturdy bay mare that belonged to the blacksmith. She grabbed a bridle and a saddle from the rack. She had grown up on a ranch. Her hands remembered the work even if her mind was screaming. She cinched the girth tight, the horse shifting uneasily. "I will send the money," she whispered to the horse, tears freezing on her cheeks. "I promise. I just need to get away." She led the horse out the back way, avoiding the main street. She mounted up, the leather cold and stiff. She turned the horse south, toward the creek, toward the emptiness. She rode out into the dark. The lights of redemption faded behind her, swallowed by the storm. She was alone again. Just Lena Marsh, just Lydia Kane, just a woman running from a past that had legs longer than any horse. Morning came slowly, a reluctant graying of the dark. The storm had not broken. It had settled into a steady, grinding assault. Eli had not slept. He sat in his room at the boarding house, staring at the wall. The image of Lydia's face burned into his retinas. "You killed him." He heard a pounding on the front door downstairs. Voices, then heavy boots on the stairs. The door to his room flew open. It was Mrs. Gable, her hair wild, her shawl hastily thrown on. "Mr. Mercer," she gasped. "You have to come. She is gone." Eli was on his feet in an instant. "Who is gone?" "Lydia, Mrs. Marsh. I went to open the shop. The back door was unlatched. Her room is empty. Her bag is gone." Eli pushed past her, running down the stairs. He hit the street running, sprinting toward the livery stable. The blacksmith was already there, standing in the open doorway, cursing. "Horse is gone," the blacksmith shouted over the wind. "My bay mare, and a saddle. Someone took her in the night." Eli stopped, his breath tearing at his lungs. He looked south. The tracks were already filled in, smoothed over by the wind. But he knew where she would go. She would try to follow the creek bed toward the railhead in Cheyenne. It was 100 miles of nothing. "She took it," Eli said. "That widow?" The blacksmith spat. "I will get the constable. We will hang her for a horse thief." "No," Eli said. He turned on the blacksmith, his face a mask of terrifying calm. "You will not. I will fetch her. Put the horse on my bill." "In this weather," the blacksmith scoffed. "You are crazy. Mercer, a rider cannot last 5 hours in this. She is probably dead already." Dead already. The words kicked Eli into motion. He grabbed his saddle from the rack. He ran to Buster's stall. The big roan nickered. Sensing the urgency, Eli worked with frantic speed. He threw on the saddle, checked the cinch. He grabbed his rifle scabbard, a coil of rope, and a heavy wool blanket. He mounted up inside the barn. He rode out into the teeth of the gale. "Lydia!" he screamed into the wind, but the sound was ripped away before it left his lips. He knew the land. He knew the creek bed. And he knew the season. The temperature was dropping. If she had left at midnight, she had been out there for 6 hours. Guilt was a spur that dug deep. He drove Buster hard, pushing the horse through the drifts. I killed her father. He thought, I will not let the winter kill her too. Lydia could not feel her feet. She had lost the feeling in her toes hours ago. Now, the numbness was creeping up her legs, a heavy, dead weight. Her hands were frozen claws around the reins. The world was white. There was no sky, no earth, only the white swirling madness. She had lost the creek bed an hour ago, or maybe 2. Time had ceased to have meaning. She was just a speck of heat in a universe of ice. The horse was stumbling. The poor beast was exhausted, its chest crusted with ice, its head hanging low. Come on, Lydia whispered through cracked, blue lips. Please. She didn't know where she was going anymore. She just knew she couldn't stop. If she stopped, the thoughts would come back. The wagon, the letter, Eli. She squeezed her eyes shut. Let it end, she thought. Just let the snow take me. It is clean. It is quiet. The horse stepped into a hole, a badger den hidden by a drift. The legs snapped with a sickening crack. The horse screamed and went down hard. Lydia was thrown. She flew through the air, landing heavily on her side. The impact knocked the breath out of her. Pain flared in her ribs. Sharp and hot, but it was distant, muffled by the cold. She lay in the snow. She tried to get up, but her limbs refused to obey. She was so tired, so incredibly tired. The horse was thrashing nearby, trying to rise, then falling back with a groan. Lydia rolled onto her back. She looked up. The snow was falling on her face, melting for a second before freezing. She closed her eyes. It wasn't so bad. Really, it was just sleep. The snow began to drift over her legs. It filled the folds of her coat. It began to erase the evidence that she had ever been there. I am sorry. Papa, she thought. I tried. Darkness began to creep in at the edges of her vision. Then, a sound. A shout. Lydia! It was faint. A ghost voice. Lydia, answer me! She frowned. Why wouldn't they let her sleep? A dark shape blocked the wind. A horse. A monster rising out of the white. Someone was jumping down into the snow beside her. Hands, rough, frantic hands, were grabbing her shoulders, shaking her. Lydia, open your eyes! She forced her lids open. A face hovered above her, a beard crusted with ice, gray eyes wild with fear. Eli, she whispered. I have got you, he choked out. I have got you. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He didn't ask why she ran. He pulled her up. She was dead weight, but he lifted her as if she were made of straw. He wrapped her in a blanket that smelled of him. He carried her to his horse. He lifted her into the saddle, swinging up behind her, wrapping his massive coat around both of them. The horse, Lydia mumbled, gesturing weakly to the fallen mare. Eli looked at the suffering animal. He pulled his revolver. Don't look, he said. He fired once. The crack was swallowed by the wind. He holstered the gun. He grabbed the reins with one hand and held Lydia tight against his chest with the other. Hold on to me, he commanded. Do not let go. He turned Buster away from the open plain. He knew of a line shack, a remnant of the old cattle drives, tucked into a draw about 2 miles east. It was a desperate gamble. If he missed it in the whiteout, they were both dead, but he couldn't go back. Redemption was too far. He drove the horse forward. He could feel Lydia shivering against him, a violent rattling tremor that shook his own bones. Stay with me, he shouted into her ear. You hear me, Lydia Kane? You do not get to quit, not today. They rode into the white void. 2 broken people clinging to each other on the edge of the world. The door of the line shack kicked open with a groan of rusted hinges, slamming against the interior wall as the wind tried to tear it from the frame. Eli Mercer stumbled inside, carrying the dead weight of Lydia Kane in his arms. He turned his shoulder into the gale, forcing the door shut against the screaming white void outside, and dropped the heavy wooden latch into place. The silence that followed was sudden and ringing. The shack was little more than a box of rough-hewn pine logs, smelling of dry rot, wood rats, and the ghost of smoke from fires burned years ago. It was freezing, the air inside only marginally warmer than the blizzard raging beyond the walls. But it was still. Eli moved to the single bunk built into the far wall. The mattress was a pile of old straw covered in ticking that had long since surrendered to dust. But he didn't hesitate. He laid Lydia down. She was curled into a tight, trembling ball, her eyes squeezed shut, her skin the color of old parchment. Her lips were a terrifying shade of blue. "Stay there," Eli rasped. His voice sounded loud in the small space. He turned to the cast-iron stove in the corner. It was a pot-belly relic, rusted red. He prayed there was wood. He found a small pile of dry cedar splits and a few twisted knots of sagebrush in a crate, left by the last cowboy to pass through, a sacred code of the high country. Eli's hands were clumsy with cold as he struck a match against his thumbnail. The flame flared, yellow and fragile. He fed it into the stove, nurturing the spark with tinder until the cedar caught with a hungry crackle. He shoved more wood in, filling the firebox, until the iron began to tick and ping with expanding heat. He went back to Lydia. She had not moved. The shivering had taken over her entire body, a violent, rattling convulsion that made her teeth click together. "Lydia," Eli said. He sat on the edge of the bunk and reached for her hands. They were like ice, stiff and unyielding. He began to rub them, chafing her skin between his rough palms. He worked with a desperate intensity, trying to force friction into heat, trying to drive the blood back into her extremities. "Come on," he muttered. "Come on, warm up," Lydia gasped, her eyes flying open. They were unfocused, wild with panic. She yanked her hands away from him as if he had burned her. "No," she whimpered. She scrambled backward, pressing herself into the corner of the bunk, pulling the dirty blanket up to her chin. "Don't!" Eli froze, his hands hovering in the air. "It is me, Lydia. It is Eli. You are freezing." "Don't touch me," she whispered. Her gaze darted around the shack, seeing the shadows, seeing the man looming over her. She wasn't seeing him, Eli realized. She was seeing every man who had ever cornered her in a room like this. "I am not going to hurt you," Eli said softly. He lowered his hands to his knees, making himself smaller, less threatening. "I am just trying to get the cold out." Lydia stared at him, her chest heaving. Slowly, the recognition seeped back into her eyes. The terror didn't leave, but it changed shape. It became shame. "Eli," she breathed. "Yeah," he said. "It is me." The stove began to radiate a faint warmth, smelling of burning sage. The wind howled outside, finding the gaps in the chinking, whistling a mournful tune that sounded like a bow drawn across a broken fiddle string. Lydia's shivering didn't stop. It was deep in her core. "You need to get those wet clothes off," Eli said gently. "The coat is soaked through." Lydia shook her head frantically. "No, I can't. You will die of pneumonia if you don't," Eli said. He stood up and turned his back to her, facing the stove. "I am not looking. Take the wet layers off and wrap yourself in the dry blanket from my saddle roll. It is wool. It will hold the heat." He heard the rustle of fabric behind him. He heard the catch in her breath, the struggle of stiff fingers against wet buttons. He stared at the glowing grate of the stove, his own heart heavy as a stone in his chest. He felt like an intruder, not just in the room, but in her life. "I am done," she whispered after a long time. Eli turned around. She was wrapped in the gray wool blanket, sitting with her knees pulled to her chest. Her wet clothes lay in a heap on the floor. Her hair, damp and tangled, hung around her face like a curtain. He picked up the wet clothes and hung them near the stove to dry. Then he pulled the wooden crate over to the bunk and sat down. He was close enough to feel the heat coming off the stove, but far enough away to give her space. "Lydia," he started. The name felt heavy on his tongue. She didn't look at him. She stared at a knot in the floorboards. "I am sorry," Eli said. The words were inadequate, small things against the magnitude of what lay between them, but they were all he had. "I am sorry I came after you. I know you wanted to run, but I couldn't let the storm take you. Why? Lydia asked. Her voice was a cracked whisper. After what I said to you? After you told me what you did? Because you were right, Eli said. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, clasping his hands together. About everything. I did help Carver. I did carry that letter. And I have spent 3 years telling myself I was just a messenger, that I didn't pull the trigger, so my hands were clean. He looked at his hands, seeing the dirt under the nails, the scars. But that is a lie, he continued. I knew Carver was a wolf. I knew he ate up land and people, and I took his money anyway, when that wagon went over the edge, when your father died. I told myself it was an accident because I was too much of a coward to admit I helped kill a man. Lydia made a small, choked sound. I have been running from that ghost ever since, Eli said. Drifting from town to town, working for small outfits, trying to be a decent man. But you can't outrun a thing like that. It rides double with you. He looked up at her, his eyes raw and unguarded. I did not know it was your father. Lydia, I swear it. But that does not matter. It was someone's father, and I helped break him. I can't fix it. I can't bring him back. But I will be damned if I was going to let his daughter die in the snow because of my sins. Lydia looked at him then. The anger that had fueled her flight was gone, burned out by the cold and the exhaustion. In its place was a vast, hollow ache. He loved that ranch, she whispered. Tears began to well in her eyes, hot and fast. He thought if he just worked hard enough, if he was honest enough, Carver would respect him. He didn't understand that men like Carver don't respect anything they can't own. I know, Eli said softly. After he died, Lydia said, her voice gaining a fragile strength. Carver came to the funeral. He took his hat off. He told my mother he was sorry for her loss. And then, a week later, he showed her the papers that said he owned the water rights. He squeezed us until there was nothing left. She pulled the blanket tighter. We went to the mining town. My mother, she just faded. It was like he had cut her root. She died in a boarding house room that smelled of cabbage and sick. Eli listened, his jaw tight. He wanted to look away, but he owed her this. He owed her his witness. I was 19, Lydia said. I had no money. I had no family. I tried to find work, washing clothes, scrubbing floors, but it wasn't enough to pay the burial costs. It wasn't enough to eat. She paused, swallowing hard. There was a woman, Mrs. Delaney. She owned the velvet slipper. She saw me on the street one day. She was kind. She gave me soup. She gave me a room. She told me I was pretty. She said I could help serve drinks. Lydia's gaze drifted past Eli, into the dark corner of the shack. It starts slow, she said. A hand on the waist. A man buying you a drink. Mrs. Delaney telling you to be nice to the customers because they spend money. And then you owe rent. And the dress she bought you costs more than you thought. And suddenly, being nice isn't enough. She shuddered, a tremor that had nothing to do with the temperature. The first time, she whispered. I threw up in the alley afterward. I scrubbed my skin until it bled. But the second time, I just went somewhere else. Inside my head, I learned how to leave the room. I learned how to separate my body from my heart. It was just meat. It was just a transaction. Eli closed his eyes for a second, feeling a wave of nausea. He imagined her, young, terrified, trapped, and he imagined the men. Men like Rourke, men like himself, who used the world as their playground. I sent money to my aunt in Ohio, Lydia said. That was the lie I told myself, that I was doing it for family, but I knew. I was just surviving. And the shame, it is like the cold. Eli, it gets into your bones. You think everyone can see it. You think it is written on your forehead. She looked at him, the tears finally spilling over, tracking through the dust on her cheeks. I ran away when I had saved enough, she said. I came here. I thought I could be Lena Marsh. I thought I could sew dresses and be clean. But you can't hide, can you? Rourke found me. You found me. Lydia, Eli said. I am so tired of hiding. she sobbed, her voice breaking. "I am so tired of being afraid that someone will see me, that someone will know." She looked at him with a devastating openness. You know everything now. My father, the brothel, the lies." "I know," Eli said. "I can't hide from you anymore," she gasped. "I have nothing left to cover myself with." Eli stood up. He moved slowly, deliberately. He crossed the small distance between the crate and the bunk. He didn't reach for her. He just stood there, letting her see him. "You don't have to hide," he said. His voice was thick with emotion. "Not from me." "How can you look at me?" she asked, wiping her face with the edge of the blanket. "Knowing what I have done? Knowing whose hands have been on me?" Eli sat on the edge of the bunk. He reached out, slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. He cupped her face in his hands. His thumbs brushed away the tears, his calluses rough against her soft skin. "I look at you," Eli said, "and I see the bravest woman I have ever met. I see a daughter who fought for her family. I see a woman who walked through hell and came out the other side still standing. I am ruined," she whispered. "No," Eli said fiercely. "You are scarred. So am I. Look at me. Lydia, I carried the letter that killed your father. Does that make me a monster? Or does it make me a man who made a terrible mistake and is trying to find a way to pay for it?" "You are not a monster," Lydia said automatically. "And you are not ruined," Eli said. "You are more than what was done to you. You are more than the lies Rourke tells. You are Lydia Kane, and you are worth 10 of him." Lydia looked into his gray eyes. She saw no judgment there, no disgust, only a deep, aching sorrow and a fierce protectiveness that made her breath catch. She leaned into his touch. For the first time in years, a man's hands felt like shelter. "Not a cage. Eli," she whispered. He leaned in. He paused, inches from her lips, asking a silent question. Lydia closed the distance. The kiss was tentative at first, a brush of lips, a question asked and answered. Lydia felt a spike of old panic, the muscle memory of bracing herself for invasion. But Eli didn't push. He didn't take. He waited. She let out a long, shaky breath against his mouth. She felt the warmth of him, the life in him, and slowly, the panic receded, replaced by something she hadn't felt in so long she had forgotten its name. "Want." She pressed closer. She reached her hands out from the blanket and gripped the front of his flannel shirt. She pulled him to her. The kiss deepened. It became a desperate thing, a collision of grief and hope. It tasted of salt tears and wood smoke. It was heat against the cold. It was two broken things finding that their jagged edges fit together. Lydia felt a fire kindle in her belly. It wasn't the shameful, hollow feeling of the brothel. It was her own. It was her desire, her choice. "Eli," she murmured against his mouth. "Stay. I am not going anywhere." He promised. He shifted, lifting the edge of the blanket. She opened it to him. He slid his arms around her, pulling her against his chest, wrapping the wool around both of them until they were a single cocoon of warmth in the freezing room. The storm raged outside. The wind battered the walls, screaming its fury. But inside, the world had shrunk to the beat of two hearts. They didn't speak much after that. There were no words left that needed saying. They lay together on the narrow bunk, fully clothed but intimately bound. Eli held her as if she were made of glass that had already been shattered and glued back together, precious, fragile, and miraculous. Lydia rested her head on his shoulder. She felt the solid thump of his heart. She felt the rise and fall of his breath. She traced the line of his jaw with her fingertips, marveling at the freedom of touching him because she wanted to. "I was so afraid," she whispered into the darkness. "I thought if anyone knew, my life would be over." "It is not over," Eli said, his lips brushing her hair. "It is just starting. Rourke will still be there," she said, reality encroaching on the edges of the moment. "The town will still talk." "Let them talk," Eli said. "Let Rourke say his piece. We will face him together. I am done running. Lydia, I am done hiding from what I did. I will stand up in front of God and everyone and say my part, and I will stand next to you while you say yours. You would do that? She asked. You would ruin your own name for me? My name is not worth much, Eli said. But if it can shield you, it is yours. Lydia closed her eyes. A tear slipped out, but it wasn't a tear of pain. It was relief. It was the feeling of a heavy pack being lifted from her shoulders after 1,000 miles of walking. She fell asleep to the sound of the wind, held in the arms of the man who had helped break her world, and who was now the only one who could help her build it back. Morning broke with a blinding brilliance. The storm had blown itself out in the small hours of the night. When Eli pushed the door open, the world was transformed. The harsh, scarred landscape of the plains was gone, buried under 2 feet of pristine, glittering white. The sun, climbing over the eastern ridge, turned the snow into a field of diamonds. The air was razor-sharp and cold, but it was still. Lydia stepped out beside him, blinking against the glare. She was wearing her dry clothes again, though they were stiff and wrinkled. She wore Eli's coat over her own, engulfed in the sheepskin. She looked out at the valley. It was beautiful. It was deadly. It was indifferent to their suffering and their joy. It is deceptive, she said quietly. It looks so clean. It is a fresh start, Eli said. He was saddling Buster, his movements efficient. If we are strong enough to take it. He turned to her. He looked different in the daylight. The tiredness around his eyes was still there, but the haunted look was gone. He looked solid, resolved. You ready? He asked. Lydia took a deep breath of the freezing air. It hurt her lungs, but it woke her up. She thought of redemption. She thought of the whispers, the judgment, the sneers of men like Rourke and the turned backs of the women. She felt the fear. Yes, it was a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, she felt the warmth of the night before. She felt the strength of the truth. She had nothing left to hide. The worst had happened. She had been exposed, and she was still standing. She looked at Eli. She saw the partner she had never expected to find. I'm ready, she said. Eli swung up into the saddle. He reached a hand down to her. Come on, he said. Lydia took his hand. He pulled her up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face into the familiar scent of his coat. They turned the horse west, back toward the plume of smoke that marked the town of Redemption. They rode slowly, picking their way through the drifts. They were 2 scars on the perfect white landscape, riding back to face the fire. But this time, they weren't burning alone. Redemption looked different in the blinding glare of the morning sun. The storm had scrubbed the sky clean, leaving it a hard, brilliant blue that offered no shelter. The snow lay thick and heavy on the roofs, dripping in long, jagged icicles that caught the light like daggers. Eli Mercer and Lydia Kane rode down the center of the main street on a single horse. Lydia sat behind the saddle, her arms wrapped around Eli's waist, her face pressed against the rough wool of his coat. They were a spectacle, a scandal on 4 legs. The town was awake. The sound of shovels scraping against wood filled the air as shopkeepers cleared their boardwalks. As the big roan horse plodded through the drifts, the scraping stopped. Heads turned. Conversations died in mid-sentence. Lydia felt the weight of the stairs. They were physical things, heavy and cold. She saw Mrs. Gable standing in the window of the dressmaker's shop, her hand flying to her throat. She saw the blacksmith emerge from the livery, a hammer in his hand, his mouth setting into a hard line of judgment. The gossip had done its work. The silence that greeted them was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a held breath before a scream. Eli kept his eyes forward, his jaw set like granite. He could feel Lydia trembling against his back, but her grip on his coat did not loosen. Steady, he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. They reached the front of the livery stable. Eli swung down, wincing slightly as his boots hit the frozen ground. He reached up and helped Lydia down. As her feet touched the earth, she felt a wave of dizziness. She was exhausted, battered, and terrified. But she was not running. Well, if it is not the happy couple, a voice rang out. Lydia froze. She knew that voice. It was the voice of her nightmares. Miles Rourke stood on the boardwalk in front of the Lucky Strike saloon. He was wearing a fresh suit, his boots polished, a cigar clamped between his teeth. A group of men stood around him, barflies, drifters, and a few locals who enjoyed the show. Rourke descended the steps, his smile wide and poisonous. "We were taking bets on whether you would come back," Rourke said, pitching his voice to carry down the street. "I put $5 on you running for the border, but I guess a woman like you knows when she has found a mark." Eli turned slowly. He ground the reins of his horse into the hitching post. He took a step toward Rourke. "Shut your mouth. Rourke," Eli said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a vibration that made the men behind Rourke shuffle their feet. "Why should I?" Rourke laughed. "The whole town knows. Mercer, I told them all about Silver Creek. I told them about the Velvet Slipper. I told them how Lila here used to entertain the miners for the price of a bottle of whiskey." He looked directly at Lydia, his eyes stripping her bare. "Tell them, sweetheart," Rourke sneered. "Tell them how you earned your keep. Tell them you are nothing but a $2 whore trying to play dress-up in a decent town." The word hung in the cold air. Whore. Lydia flinched as if he had struck her. She saw the faces of the townspeople gathering on the boardwalks. She saw the disgust on the faces of the women, the leering curiosity on the faces of the men. Eli snapped. The rage that had been simmering in his guts since the alleyway boiled over. "You are a dead man," Eli growled. He lunged. His hand went for the Colt on his hip. Rourke stumbled back, reaching for a hideout gun inside his coat. The tension crackled like dry lightning, sharp and lethal. "No!" Lydia moved. She didn't run away. She didn't hide behind Eli. She stepped between them. She placed her hand on Eli's chest, pushing him back. He was a wall of muscle and fury, but he stopped at her touch. He looked down at her, his eyes wild. "Lydia," he warned. "Step aside." "No," Lydia said. Her voice shook, but she forced a volume into it. "No more fighting in alleys. No more hiding." She turned to face Rourke. She turned to face the town. She walked to the bottom of the saloon steps. She climbed up 2 stairs so that she stood above the mud, above the crowd. She looked out at the faces. Mrs. Higgins, the constable, the farmers, the wives. "He wants to talk about my past," Lydia said. Her voice broke, then strengthened. She took a deep breath of the freezing air. "So let us talk about it." Rourke looked confused. He had expected tears. He had expected shame. He had not expected this. "My name is not Lena Marsh," she said. "My name is Lydia Kane. My father was Elias Kane. We had a ranch in the Bitterroot foothills. It was small, but it was ours." She saw a flicker of recognition in the eyes of an old rancher near the general store. "Silas Carver wanted our water," Lydia continued. "He offered to buy us out for pennies. My father said no. He said no for 2 years, and then there was an accident, a wagon accident." She looked at Eli for a brief second, drawing strength from his presence. "Carver took the land," she said. "He took the cattle. My mother and I were left with nothing. We went to Silver Creek because there was nowhere else to go. My mother died there, in a room with no heat, because we could not afford a doctor." Tears began to stream down her face, but she did not wipe them away. She let them fall. "I was 19, she said. "I was alone, and I was hungry. Miles Rourke is right. I worked at the Velvet Slipper. I sold the only thing I had left to sell because I wanted to live. I wanted to survive." She looked directly at Mrs. Gable. "I am not proud of it," Lydia said. "But I am not ashamed of surviving. I did what I had to do, and I came here to try to build something clean, to try to be the woman I was before men like Carver and Rourke decided I was disposable." Silence stretched out over the street. It was a different kind of silence now. It was uncomfortable. It was heavy with the weight of truth. Some of the women looked away, their expressions hard and unforgiving. But others, the ones who knew what it was to count pennies, the ones who knew the fear of a bad winter, looked at her with a dawning, reluctant empathy. Eli stepped up beside her. He did not touch her. He stood close enough that his shoulder brushed hers, a solid presence against the wind. She is telling the truth, Eli said. His voice rumbled across the gathered crowd. And here's the rest of it. He looked at the men he had worked with, the people he had nodded to in the street. I rode for Silas Carver, Eli said. For 2 years, I took his money, and 3 years ago, I carried a sealed letter to the foreman near the Bitterroot. That letter was the order to cut the brake lines on Elias Kane's wagon. A gasp ran through the crowd. Murder. It was a word that changed everything. I did not know what was in the letter, Eli said. But I carried it. I helped kill an honest man, and I helped put this woman in that brothel just as surely as if I had dragged her there myself. He looked at Rourke, who was suddenly looking very pale. I walked away, Eli said. I ran from it, but I am done running. Lydia Kane is the bravest person standing on the street today, and if any of you have a problem with her, you have a problem with me. The confession hung there, stripping away Eli's last defense. He had admitted to being an accessory to murder. He had given the constable every reason to hang him, but the reaction wasn't anger at Eli. It was a sudden, terrifying clarity. A small rancher named Jebediah Stone stepped forward. He took off his hat, twisting it in his hands. Carver's men, Stone said, his voice gravelly. They cut my north fence last week, dropped 50 head of steers on my winter grass. Another voice spoke up, a widow from the edge of town. My husband, before he died, he said Carver threatened to burn our barn if we did not sell the water rights to the creek. He came to my place too, the blacksmith muttered. Told me who I could shoe for and who I couldn't. The dam broke. The fear that had kept the town silent, the fear of Carver's money and his guns, began to crack under the weight of Lydia and Eli's honesty. It was a rough, angry solidarity. They realized they were all being squeezed by the same hand. Suddenly, the ground began to tremble. The sound of heavy hooves on frozen earth echoed from the north end of town. The crowd turned. Silas Carver rode into redemption. He did not ride alone. He was flanked by 6 men, all of them heavily armed, their horses blowing steam. Carver sat on a massive black stallion, wearing a coat with a fur collar that cost more than most of the town earned in a year. His face was a mask of cold, arrogant fury. He had heard the rumors of defiance. He had come to stomp out the spark before it became a fire. He pulled his horse up 10 yards from the saloon steps. The crowd parted, fear instinctively making them clear a path. Carver looked at Lydia. He looked at Eli. His lip curled in a sneer. Mercer, Carver said. His voice was smooth, cultured, and terrifying. I heard you were telling tall tales. I am telling the truth. Silas, Eli said. He stepped down from the stairs, placing himself between Lydia and the riders. The truth about the Kane wagon, the truth about the land. You are a drifter and a liar, Carver said dismissively. He looked at Lydia. And you, I remember you, the little girl who thought her father was a king. I see you found your true calling in the mining camps. My father was a better man than you will ever be, Lydia said. She did not step back. She stood tall, her chin lifted, refusing to be shamed into silence by the man who had stolen her life. Constable, Carver barked, not looking away from Lydia. Arrest these 2 for slander and horse theft. I want them in irons. Constable Miller stood on the boardwalk. He was an older man, paunchy and tired. He had spent his life avoiding trouble. He looked at Carver's gunmen. He looked at Eli. Standing alone in the street, he looked at Lydia, her face pale but resolute. And he looked at his town. He saw the faces of his neighbors, Stone, the blacksmith, the widow. They were watching him. They were waiting to see if the law meant anything in redemption, or if it was just a word for the rich man's will. Miller stepped down into the mud. He unsnapped the leather thong over his revolver. No, Miller said. Carver blinked. Excuse me? I said no, Miller said, his voice gaining strength. I heard the testimony. Mr. Carver. I heard Mrs. Kane. I heard Mr. Mercer. And I have heard enough complaints from these folks to fill a ledger. You are making a mistake, Miller, Carver warned. His hand hovered over his holster. The only mistake, Eli said, Is you thinking you own this town? Carver's eyes snapped to Eli. The arrogance cracked. He saw the threat. He saw that the town was not cowering this time. Take them! Carver ordered his men. It happened in a heartbeat. One of Carver's riders, a man with a scar across his nose, went for his gun. Down! Eli screamed. He shoved Lydia backward, sending her stumbling behind the solid oak of a water trough. Eli drew. His motion was fluid, practiced. Crack! Crack! Gunfire erupted, shattering the morning stillness. The sound was deafening in the narrow street. Eli fired. The rider with the scar jerked backward, spinning out of his saddle and hitting the ground. But Eli wasn't fast enough to dodge everything. A bullet from another rider tore through his left shoulder. The impact spun him around. He grunted, stumbling to one knee, his gun hand wavering. Eli! Lydia screamed. The town exploded into action. This wasn't a duel. It was a riot. Get him! The blacksmith shouted. A shotgun roared from the balcony of the hotel. One of Carver's men yelled as buckshot tore into his arm. His horse reared, throwing him. The farmers and shopkeepers didn't have the skill of gunfighters, but they had numbers and they had rage. They poured into the street, brandishing rifles and pistols. Carver's men panicked. They were mercenaries, paid to bully, not to die for a paycheck. Two of them wheeled their horses and galloped south, fleeing the chaos. Carver was left alone in the center of the storm. His horse danced nervously. He looked around, seeing his power evaporate. You are under arrest. Carver! Constable Miller shouted, leveling his pistol. For the murder of Elias Kane! Carver looked at the constable. He looked at Eli, who was struggling to stand, blood soaking the sleeve of his coat. Carver made his choice. He wasn't going to jail. He was Silas Carver. He reached for the pearl-handled revolver at his waist. Eli saw it. Adrenaline flooded his system, overriding the pain in his shoulder. He didn't shoot. He dropped his gun and launched himself forward. He hit Carver just as the man pulled the pistol free. Eli grabbed Carver's leg and heaved with everything he had left. Carver shouted as he was ripped from the saddle. He crashed into the frozen mud. The wind knocked out of him. His gun skittered away across the ice. Eli landed on top of him. He slammed Carver into the ground, his good hand pinning the rancher's throat. It is over, Eli rasped, blood dripping from his shoulder onto the snow. It is done, Carver gasped, his eyes bulging. He looked up and saw not fear, but the cold, hard eyes of a man who had stopped running. Constable Miller moved in, handcuffs glinting in the sun. He hauled Carver up, snapping the irons onto his wrists. Get him out of here, Miller said to his deputy. The street fell silent, save for the heavy breathing of men and the stamping of horses. The snow was stained with red. Lydia ran from behind the trough. She fell to her knees in the mud beside Eli. Eli, she choked out, her hands hovering over his torn shoulder. You are hurt. Eli looked at her. His face was gray with pain, but he managed a weak smile. I have had worse, he whispered. Just a scratch, Lydia laughed, a sound that was half sob. She pressed her forehead against his good shoulder. You are a terrible liar. Eli Mercer. The aftermath was quiet. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind the dull ache of reality. Lydia tended to Eli in her small room above the general store. The light was dim, the shades drawn against the glare of the snow. She worked with steady hands now. She cut away the ruined shirt, cleaning the wound with hot water and whiskey. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of the shoulder, missing the bone and the artery. It would leave a scar, but he would keep the arm. Eli sat on the edge of the bed, his teeth gritted against the sting of the alcohol. You have a gentle touch, he said, his voice tight. For a horse thief. Lydia looked up, pausing in her bandaging. And you have a thick head. For a hero. I am no hero, Eli said. He looked down at his hands. Carver will get a lawyer. He has money. He might never see the inside of a prison cell. Maybe, Lydia said. She tied the bandage off, her fingers brushing his skin. But he is in irons tonight, and everyone saw it. The spell is broken. Eli, he can't scare us anymore. She sat back, wiping her hands on a rag. I was so afraid, she admitted softly. When the shooting started, I thought I had lost you. Just when I found you, "You are stuck with me," Eli said. He reached out with his good hand, taking hers. "I promised. No more running." Lydia squeezed his hand. "I am still afraid," she whispered, "of what people will say. Of tomorrow, of waking up and realizing this was all a dream." "It is not a dream," Eli said. "And let them talk. We will give them something better to talk about." He pulled her closer until her head rested on his chest. "We will be all right," he said. And for the first time in her life, Lydia believed it. Epilogue. 6 months later, the high plains were burning, not with fire, but with the fierce, relentless heat of July. The wind that had once been a blade of ice was now a dry, cracking force that turned the earth to dust. On the southern edge of the valley, where the land rose up to meet the foothills, a small cabin stood against the vastness. It was not much, 2 rooms, a sturdy porch, and a barn that smelled of fresh pine. In the corral, a young foal, legs spindly and awkward, chased its mother. It was the first of the herd. Lydia wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She was in the garden, fighting a war against the weeds that threatened her rows of beans and squash. Her hands were brown from the sun, rough from work. She wore a simple calico dress, the hem stained with soil. She stood up, arching her back to work out the ache. She looked toward the pasture. Eli was there. He was fixing a gate, his hammer rising and falling in a steady rhythm. His shoulder had healed, though it stiffened up when the rain came. He moved with the easy grace of a man who belonged to the land, not a man drifting across it. They were poor. They counted every copper penny. They worried about the drought, about the price of hay, about the late frosts that could kill a crop in a night. But they were free. The sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the sawtooths, painting the sky in bruised purples and violently bright golds. The light softened the harsh lines of the valley, turning the sagebrush to silver. Eli put down his tools and walked toward the house. He took off his hat, wiping the dust from his face. Lydia met him on the porch. She handed him a tin cup of cool water from the well. "Hot one," Eli said, drinking deep. "Storm coming," Lydia said, pointing to the dark clouds gathering in the west. "I can smell the rain." "Good," Eli said. "The grass needs it." He leaned against the porch rail, looking out at the horizon. Lydia moved to stand beside him. She leaned her weight against his arm. She thought about the girl she had been, the girl in the carriage, terrified and hiding. She thought about the woman in the brothel, numb and cold. Those ghosts were still there. They would always be there, but they didn't haunt this house. Eli wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. He smelled of sweat and horses and sage. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Lydia looked up at him. "I was thinking about hiding." Eli raised an eyebrow. "You thinking of running off again?" "No," she said softly. She reached up and touched the gray at his temples. "I was thinking that I can't hide from you anymore. Not my scars, not my fears." She smiled, and it was a smile that reached her eyes. "And not this." "Not what?" "This love," she said. "It grew in the dirt, Eli, in the hardest ground I ever saw. But it has roots now, deep ones." Eli kissed her forehead. "I wouldn't want it any other way." "Lydia." They stood together in the fading light. 2 people shaped by tragedy. 2 people who had seen the worst of the world and chosen each other anyway. The wind picked up, smelling of rain and sage, blowing across the miles of open country. They turned their faces toward the darkening horizon, ready for the storm, ready for the work, ready for tomorrow. Author's note: Thank you so much for journeying with me through the snow and grit of redemption. It has been a pleasure to bring Lydia and Eli's story to life for you. I would love to hear where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below telling me your location and sharing your thoughts on the story in English. Did Lydia and Eli's ending resonate with you? If you enjoyed this tale of the American West, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of romance, danger, and the enduring human spirit on the frontier. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open.